From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good morning, and welcome to the John W. Kluge Center at the Library of Congress. I'm Janice Hyde, Interim Director of the Kluge Center, which is delighted to serve as the host for today's symposium, Saving the Web, the Ethics and Challenges of Preserving What's on the Internet. Before we begin, please take a moment to silence your cell phones and other electronic devices. Thank you. Today's program is being recorded for the Library of Congress and Kluge Center websites, as well as for future placement on the library's YouTube and iTunes channels. We are also live tweeting this event, so if you would like to tweet, retweet, or just follow the Twitter conversation, please do so using hashtag #SaveTheWeb. The Kluge Center brings together scholars and researchers from around the world to exchange ideas and energize one another, to distill wisdom from the library's rich resources, and to interact with policymakers and the public. It also administers the Kluge Prize, periodically conferred by the Librarian of Congress to recognize lifetime achievement in the study of humanity. To learn more about its programs and opportunities, please visit the Center's website at loc.gov/Kluge. For the past few months, the Kluge Center has been privileged to have in residence Dame Wendy Hall, who has served as the Kluge Chair in Technology and Society. The Chair in Technology and Society is a senior scholar position focusing on the impact of fast-changing technology on human societies. The scholar makes use of rapidly growing digital resources of the Library of Congress, augmented by science and technology data and documentation from around the world. Today's symposium helps mark the culmination of Wendy's research and reflection while at the center, and we are honored to have served as her host. It is now my pleasure to welcome to the podium someone who is intimately familiar with the management of vast amounts of information on a daily basis. David Mao currently leads the institution as the Acting Librarian of Congress. He previously served as the Deputy Librarian of Congress, and prior to that, he was the 23rd Law Librarian of Congress. In that position, he expanded the law library's collections, especially its rare books, supported efforts to make U.S. public domain legal materials accessible online, and brought to the library a 1215 Magna Carta for an historic exhibition to commemorate the Great Charter's 800th anniversary. Please join me in welcoming David Mao.
Thank you so much, Janice, and good morning to all of you. As Janice said, I have the privilege of serving as the Acting Librarian of Congress, and one of the joys of being the Acting Librarian of Congress is I get to welcome groups, and I'm really excited to be able to welcome all of you to the library today. I understand over the last 2 days, many of you here have participated in a datathon here, which Dame Wendy Hall, along with her colleagues Ian Mulligan, who is here, and Matt Weber, and Jimmy Lin have helped coordinate, and all of you have participated in this exciting event here at the library. And it was developed with the generous support from the National Science Foundation, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, the Internet Archives, Rutgers University, and the University of Waterloo. So we thank all of them for helping to support this program here at the library. We at the library are co-hosting this event the library is hosting this event with several co-hosts from within the library. Janice mentioned the John W. Kluge Center, but I would like to also mention a couple of other entities here at the library that have participated. The Law Library of Congress, the library's National Digital Initiatives Office, and the Web Archiving Program. Now, web archiving is nothing new to the library. In fact, we've had a program here since about 2000. And so over the last 15 or 16 years, we've amassed quite a bit of data, as you can imagine, a lot. And we're not exactly sure what we're doing with it, in the sense that there is just a lot of challenges, and so it's particularly timely that we have this datathon and, in fact, this symposium today to talk about the issues associated with web archiving. The datathon yesterday and the day before, it provided an opportunity to explore cutting-edge research tools and also the development of a broad-based consensus on how we can approach this issue. And so today, you will hear the culmination of those 2 days of talking and discussing. And you also hear from a panel of experts on some additional ideas. And so hopefully this will just generate some good thoughts moving forward and continue moving us forward. And we would not be able to do this, of course, without Dame Wendy Hall. And so it is my pleasure now to be able to provide a brief introduction, although I know she doesn't need an introduction to any of you. We are just very, very honored that she was able to be in residence here at the library for the last couple of months. She's brought with her terrific energy, intellect, goodwill, and we are very, very grateful that she has spent the time and helped us to coordinate this event. So the Datathon and today's events, I think, are a testament to her expertise because she's been able to gather a group of high-profile thinkers from various disciplines across the world to talk about saving the web, and that's really what we really need to talk about, and it's a pressing challenge for us here at the library, institutions around the world, cultural institutions, as we try and think about how we are going to preserve all of this information. Just a brief snapshot of her background. She's a professor of computer science at the University of Southampton in England. She's a pioneer in research and an early collaborator with Tim Berners-Lee on the development of the web, which built on the work of Vint Cerf, who we're very, very delighted to be able to welcome to the library today. Her work has been at the forefront of computer science, multimedia and hypermedia, the semantic web, and digital libraries, and she's done this for quite some time, almost 30 years, I think. So here at the library, she has been working on a project titled Internet Histories and Futures, and on that project she's been using the library's collections to explore the economic, social, and technical dimensions that have contributed to the development of the web as a social technical system. She's been the Senior Vice President of the Royal Academy of Engineering, a member of the UK Prime Minister's Council for Science and Technology, a founding member of the Scientific Council of the European Research Council, a Fellow of the Royal Society, and most importantly, she is a Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire. So please join me in welcoming Dame Wendy.
Very much. Thank you so much, David. I don't want to take a lot of your time. I want to thank David and everyone at the Library of Congress and the Kluge Centre for making me so welcome, for really helping with this event, which we hope will be seminal in the development of this world, this new world. And I've had a wonderful time, and there'll always be a special place in my heart now for the Library of Congress, and I hope to come back many times and visit. You'll hear a bit more from me later, but it's my privilege now to not stand very long between you and our first keynote speaker, Vint Cerf, who doesn't need an introduction. You have all our bios for the speakers today on the, except one, Abby, but you have the bio of Vint. Now, we wouldn't be here today talking about this if it wasn't for people like Vint Cerf and Bob Kahn. And I don't think people realise how unbelievably seminal their work was in creating the open and free internet. And it's always in peril with the different forces on it. And we have to continue to support the efforts of the people, still led by Vint and Bob, who work hard to keep the internet alive for us. It's a very short time in the period of history. When you look at what's happened, what's here in the library and other institutional libraries around the world, it's only decades since we've had this. This is a blink of the eye in terms of civilization, and we really, really have to make sure that we preserve its openness and its freedom for the future of humanity. Now, Vint has, because of his work, is very well honoured. He has received many awards and medals. He's met every president, every head of state, I think. he can outdo me on name dropping, and that's... I've never met the Emperor of Japan. The wonderful thing about Vint is he's still giving back. The fact that he's here today, he's been on the West Coast, we were out there, we've both recently been presidents of the ACM, we were out there for the big ACM Council and Awards banquet. He only flew back yesterday and tomorrow he goes to Barcelona. And yet he's found time to come here this morning to talk to us, because I know everything else he does, he's absolutely passionate about preserving the content that has been put onto this amazing system that he and others created. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Vint Cerf.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much, Wendy, for a very friendly introduction. I always get nervous when people clap before you've said anything. It makes me feel like I should just sit down because it won't get any better than that. I have the sad duty to tell you that Bob Kahn is not going to be able to join us today. His sister passed away on Monday, and he is in Cleveland seeing to all of the things associated with that. He passes along his regrets and hopes that there'll be another opportunity for him to join us. I will try to offer some information that Bob would have given. I won't do it with nearly the same panache that Bob does, but I'll do my best. So let me start, assuming I can get this thing to behave properly. Und for our next trick, ladies and gentlemen, let's see. There we go. So I want to introduce a term, digital vellum, and I want to explain that it isn't just about the physical medium. This is an environment that I would like to see become real. And it has a great deal to do with the preservation of information associated with online and digital content. So let me begin by observing, well, maybe it doesn't want to. What does that mean? It has frozen. So that's the end of my talk. I guess that's it. Let's try. Wow. Oh, here we go. Now it's waking up. All right. I don't know why the other little arrows didn't work, but anyway. So let me first of all draw your attention to something you already know, and you've spent 2 days talking about. I'm sorry I wasn't here to participate. And that's that this is a huge problem, and the scope is quite dramatic. For one thing, we have all these digital structures, and they're complex. They have many representations. We need vocabulary in order to talk about this stuff. We need identifier spaces in order to make reference to these digital objects that we're trying to hang on to. And we have to resolve those references to the actual object itself. The irony of the World Wide Web is that the domain name system and the URLs that are derived from the domain names are not necessarily stable. As you know, if you fail to pay your annual fee for registration, the domain name may go away and all the URLs associated with it may also become unreachable. Everybody here has experienced 404, site not found. So we need to do something about that. Bob Kahn has this digital object architecture, which I will talk about later. It has the unfortunate acronym of DOA. I thought maybe he ought to come out with something else. But in any case, it's a very thoughtful mechanism for preserving identifiers over long periods of time that are not changing, they are not reassigned, they're stable. We plainly need standards in order to preserve this digital content, and the ingestion process to bring in digital objects needs to be pretty rigorous because we have to capture a great deal of metadata associated with this acquisition. There are also these really interesting legal questions that arise having to do with copyright not only on the objects themselves or patents on the software used to render the objects, and licensing and other kinds of things. I think that the copyright law should be amended in order to give rights to agencies like the Library of Congress that are in the business of digital preservation. We have this fair use notion here in the US, and I think a preservation arrangement also ought to be incorporated into our thinking. And finally, we need business models to retain this vast and increasing amount of digital content over long periods of time. And here I'm not talking about decades, I'm talking about centuries. And business models for centuries are hard to come by. I can think of a few. There are some breweries that have been around for about 400 or 500 years. And of course, there's always the Catholic Church. So anyway. The other thing which I find very interesting is that the OAIS definitions that I'm sure you're all familiar with have this interesting recursive property that you have these digital representations of the objects that you're preserving, and there are recursive references to this until you get down to the point where there's some specific group whose domain knowledge is sufficient to correctly interpret the content that's been preserved. And at that point, it has to stop somewhere. But the problem is the groups that understand the details may eventually die out, in which case we may have to recur once more in order to make sure that subsequent users have enough information to correctly interpret the content. So there's a lot of formality hiding in here, but it's going to be necessary. And of course, we'll have to have all kinds of specializations for representations for particular kinds of data. And I include not simply documents that you would typically find here in this library, but also scientific data, data collection from space missions at NASA, and data coming from the Large Hadron Collider. All of that stuff is digital content worthy of preservation. So it needs to be systematic. I'm not necessarily arguing that the OAIS concepts are the only ones that can be applied here, but they certainly are representative of the style that I think is necessary. And within our own research organizations here in the United States, PCAST and the OSTP have strongly recommended that research sponsored by the U.S. government should incorporate saving of the data, software, and metadata associated with that research so that it can be made available in perpetuity to the future researchers. I also think that if we're going to build archives, we'd better build more than one for the possibility that only one goes away and then everything is lost. So distributing the information across multiple archives strikes me as a wise move. And finally, we need policy frameworks that will provide incentives for people to build and operate these archives. So let me switch gears for a moment and move into some of the more substantive questions. One of them has to do with how we archive static content. Some of you will have noticed that there are certain media that have lasted for quite a long time, by accident in some cases, like these cuneiform tablets that were essentially made on clay. Most of them were intended to be reused, except the fires burned down some of the archives and baked the clay into its permanent form, which is why we still have some of them. Now, what I don't like about this is preservation by accident. I think that those of us in this room should be paying attention to preservation on purpose, and we should have ways of doing that. Now, we've also seen other documents. Vellum, for example, is quite a resilient material, which is why I thought the term digital vellum captured a little bit of that notion. Unfortunately, I think that to preserve all the digital information on real vellum would require a lot of goats and sheep and more than exist even in New Zealand. So we need to do something comparable with different media. And we've all seen the accidental preservation of papyrus, for example, because it happened to have been stored in a cave in a desert where it was dry. But again, I don't want preservation by accident. Now, when digital technologies emerged over the past 70 years, people got very excited because bits seem to have this ethereal ability to just live forever. After all, they're just logical bits, right? But they actually have physical manifestations. And I will tell you, showing up here at the Library of Congress a decade and a half ago with some CD-ROMs, thinking, look at all the data we can store in such a small amount of space. I'm so proud of myself. And one of the librarians here came back with a vellum manuscript that was 1,000 years old and still as readable today as it was then, if you happen to speak, in ancient Greek, etc. And she said to me, "And how long will your polycarbonate CD-ROM last?" And of course, I didn't have a very good answer for that. It might only be 20 years before it delaminates. But the more severe problem is that the reader for it might not be available either, not even in the Smithsonian, or if it is, it might not be in workable form. So you see all these examples of media that have come and gone. If you buy Macintosh equipment like I do, you might have regretted discovering that the latest versions don't have a CD-ROM reader in them at all, to save space, I guess. But it means my stack of media that I carefully accumulated is no longer useful because I can't read it. So that's a serious problem, and it gets worse. I mean, we have all these other media, like YouTube and Flickr and Picasa and so on, all these online media. So what I tell other audiences, you know this as well as anyone, but I try to give them a sense for why this is important. So those of you, I hope, who've read A Team of Rivals by Doris Kearns Goodwin will have noticed how well she reproduced the conversations of the time. I mean, it felt like she had been a fly on the wall, although we knew she wasn't there in the 1860s. So how did she do that? Well, she ran around to, I don't know how many libraries. I put 100 down here just as a placeholder. But she got the correspondence of the principals in this story, so she knew what they were talking about and how they expressed themselves and what positions they took. And she was able to reproduce the conversations in what I thought was a very credible way. So imagine that you're a 22nd century Doris Kearns Goodwin and you're trying to reproduce the tenor of the times in the 21st century. What will she find? Will the National Archives have anything useful to share with us? What about all the email and the tweets and the blogs and everything else? Will any of that be renderable in the 22nd century? And the answer is we don't know. And I think we don't have very good answers at this point. And it gets even more complicated when you think about executable content. This is not static stuff. This requires interpretation by software, and people are interacting with it. It's not just games. I mean, there are other kinds of applications too, things like spreadsheets and so on, which are things you interact with. A static version of a spreadsheet is typically a snapshot of its current values, but the value of the spreadsheet is the ability to put different values in and have the software run. So we have this executable content that we have to think about in the archival context. So there are a bunch of challenges, and I suppose over the last 2 days you've been talking about these and others, but I will remind you of the ones that come to my mind. One is figuring out what the bits mean at all. The second one is the metadata capture. The third is hanging on to executable code or source code if we can get it. And then this question of how do I figure out how to run old code? And I've been using a kind of a metaphor here. If you could take a digital X-ray of a computer where it has the operating system, the application, the actual files that it's working on, plus the hardware, and you could take a snapshot of all that and then reinstantiate it by emulating the hardware and running the old operating system and putting the application on it, you might actually be able to preserve the capability to run all this old software over long periods of time. Of course, you also have to have a place to store all this stuff, so we have to have affordable, large-scale memory. Now, unfortunately, we live in a world which is filled with change, and one of the things is that companies don't necessarily last forever, so they go bankrupt. And some of their assets turn out to be things that get sold to other people. So if a company goes bankrupt that made the application software that you used to produce new content, and you say after the company goes bankrupt, can I have a copy of the program? Can I have the source code? And the bankruptcy judge says no, unless you want to pay $6 million for this asset. Or they have companies that just say, I can't support this anymore. I'm not going to make it run, it being an application, run on the current day's operating systems or next year's operating systems. And now you're stuck because either you have to keep using the old operating system to use the old application, or you have to hope somebody can translate the documents that you produced or the object you produced into something that the new software will interpret. And we know that not everybody is going to pay attention to backward compatibility. So there are really tough problems. So there's questions about who owns the software, in addition to who owns the digital objects, and under what circumstances you have access to that software. And so, again, I keep thinking we need legal frameworks that provide exceptions for preservation purposes. So there is a project at Carnegie Mellon, which I hope some of you may already know about, called Olive, which is like the thing you put in your cocktail glass. This is being run, or was run, under NSF support by Mahadev Satyanarayanan. We call him Satya for obvious reasons. This was a very successful effort to essentially emulate old hardware and run old operating systems on the system. Now, this is not easy. It might sound like it's easy, but it's not. There's a whole lot of things that have to be emulated or correctly identified in order to make it work. One of them is making sure you understand exactly how the old hardware works, so you can emulate exactly how that hardware executes instructions in a virtual environment. Then you have to be able to bring in the operating system and the applications and so on. And that includes all the libraries, executable libraries that are needed to make the applications work. So it just goes on and on. Language settings have to be known. What if this is an application that was written for Bulgarian instead of English or French or something else? So there's a whole lot of details that have to be remembered and replicated in order to make this stuff work. And that's why this term digital X-ray seems so attractive. Now, what was very interesting is that he said, well, all right, so I'm going to ingest into this space of preservation all of the description of the hardware, all of the operating system, all the executable libraries, all of the application, plus the actual object that's being interpreted, and incorporate that into a great big bundle and run it as in a virtual machine environment. And in his first work, he did this on a laptop that was capable of emulating other hardware. But he had an idea that these virtual machines are so big that he ought to find some alternative way of running the software than having to draw it all into one box all at once. So he got this idea about using the streaming video, which all of us see on YouTube and other applications, as a metaphor for pulling only that which is needed from this gigantic virtual machine into the executing environment. And so it's sort of like a paging system in a time-shared machine. So it's actually not too easy, though. In the case of streaming video, it's pretty well ordered. You just pull in the next frame, and if you want to get a little ahead of the game, you pull in a few more frames ahead of time, so that if there's some stuttering in the network, you don't see a flicker in the video or stutter in the audio. But in the case of a virtual machine execution, if you're taking pages of software in, the program jumps around, and so the pages that are needed are not necessarily just in simple sequential order. So you have to be pretty clever about drawing in pieces of the virtual machine as needed in order to execute that. So he basically uses demand paging, which is to say if you're executing a piece of code and it needs to get to another part of the executable program, you just pull the page in when it's needed, but then you try to watch what the patterns are and you pre-fetch pages to avoid delay in order to make this work. So I know that you don't want to dive, I assume you don't want to dive too deep into all this. So I'm not going to talk about every single layer in this architecture, except to say that it's like any other conventional machine, except you run a virtual machine kernel so that it can emulate the hardware of machines that are no longer available. And then you run the operating system inside of that environment and then run the application. So the virtual machine image has all of this stuff that's needed, and it's expressed in XML, so this looks like a web application. So you can imagine simply running on a computer connected to the internet something that looks like it's connected to a server on the World Wide Web, and it's pulling in XML pages, but in fact what it's doing is running this virtual machine. So this is sort of an image of what it looks like. He's using the QEMU, KVM kernel virtual machine. And then, for example, he was running Microsoft Windows, and he was running an app on top of that. He has a cache, which is the clean cache, which it hasn't experienced any execution. And then as the program runs, he has to keep track of what's changed. and he goes out and pulls stuff in. So the way this tends to work is that you can even run this in such a way where the virtual machine is not even on your desktop or laptop. It's actually running in the cloud. And the only thing that you present to the client is the image. Some of you may even remember something called X Windows that was developed at MIT, which had a similar kind of notion. You just displayed the bits that were appropriate on the screen, and all the other execution, including the generation of the display, was done back in the server. So we can certainly consider doing that as well in order to limit what is needed on the client side. So we still have a long ways before we're done with all this. For one thing, actually handling this increasingly large virtual machine structure is not so easy, and yet we are expanding. Those of us who build cloud systems, Google and Microsoft and IBM and elsewhere, Amazon, are building larger and larger capacity systems with multi-core processors and more memory. But the hardest part seems to be getting precision in the emulation of the hardware, including mistakes that have been made in the hardware that the application actually relied on, even though it was a bug in the hardware design. And so getting that accurately is tricky. And not all machine designers are necessarily willing to hand out to you the details of their hardware instruction set. And so here's another example of a kind of exception one would look for preservation purposes. I think I won't go through this list completely, but the idea here is for us to recognize that we're going to need expertise in the hardware space and the operating system space, and if we're going to make this a general purpose notion, we have to ask ourselves, will people who write operating systems be willing to part with the source code? Will they be willing to make available executable object code? Will they be willing to do this on a regular basis for purposes of preservation? Will they allow execution of the emulated hardware and the emulated operating system for thousands of people and not necessarily get paid for that? At some point, the patents expire, the other rights expire, and the general public needs to have access to these executables if they're going to be able to reference material which doesn't run in any other environment. This should be of personal concern to those of you who produce content, because if you have experience like I have, material produced 20 years ago that no longer is accessible. I have PowerPoint slides from 1997 that don't run on today's PowerPoint. And this is not a gratuitous dig at Microsoft. I'm not expecting them to be able to run backward compatibility for 20 years, but it's really a shock when you pull up something that you worked hard on and realize that it's not available anymore and its content has been lost. And so I actually kept an old IBM ThinkPad around running Windows XP and an old version of Microsoft that just happens to reach far enough back to pick up those pages. But I've had to reproduce the pages. So I want to turn now to this is one part of the story, and it's using virtual machine technology in order to preserve executability over a long period of time. But I want to turn now to the self-archiving web idea. This notion was first introduced to me last year by Tim Berners-Lee and David Reed and Brewster. And the idea was that the web is this ephemeral thing. We all realize that the web is what it is in the instant. It doesn't automatically archive itself. It doesn't remember previous pages. And so all we see when we go online is today's web. We don't see yesterday's web or yesteryear's web. And that's a pity, because seeing things over a period of time can often be extremely illuminating. I've been told more than once that content that might be very important to understanding our history may not appear to be important for quite a long time, 100 years, 200 years, until finally we realize, looking back, this document, that decision, this website marked an important moment in our history, but we didn't know that at the time because we didn't have enough perspective. And so preservation of this content is really important. So I've been thinking a lot about this, and I think the success of the internet might teach us a few lessons about how to approach a self-archiving web design. One of them is that collaboration and cooperation were essential to the Internet's evolution. Bob Kahn and I may have started all this, but believe me, it took millions of people, and still does, to keep the network going and growing and changing and evolving. And the atmosphere around its creation invited that. It was a very open design. Anyone with an idea was free to express that idea and try to persuade others that they should adopt those ideas. And in the Internet Engineering Task Force, where the standards are made, that process continues. Arguments are based on merit, not based on anything else. And if your ideas are accepted, they get implemented, and if they aren't, they don't. The other thing that was important is that we published the design openly without any restrictions, which is kind of amazing when you consider this was done in 1973 in the middle of the Cold War. And we just published the details of the architecture and the protocols. And people have asked us, how did you get permission to do that? And the answer is, well, we didn't ask. But we had a rationale for it. We said, okay, we want this to be available to the American Defense Department so they don't have to buy a particular brand of machine in order to network them. Because back then we had SNA for IBM, we had DECnet for digital. But we didn't think the Defense Department should be forced into buying only one brand of machine to have networks. So we said, let's do a non-proprietary design. And then we said, our allies will probably need access to this too, because we'll want them to be able to interwork in a command and control system built on top. Then we said, okay, so who are our allies? And well, we could answer that question in 1973. But we said, well, who will they be 25 years from now? And we weren't sure. We looked back 25 years and realized that the allies of today, that is 73, were different from the ones 25 years ago. So we assumed that we would not know who our allies were 25 years from now. And since this needed to work, we said everybody has to be able to do it. So we just published openly and said, if you can build stuff that works this way and hook it and find somebody to connect to, it should work. And so the internet grew in a very organic way precisely for that reason. We also said we didn't care what the business model was. And so we said, it has to work this way, but we don't care what your business model is. So we have nonprofit networks, and we have for-profit networks, government-operated networks, private networks like the ones you run at home with your Wi-Fi service that connect into the rest of the internet. We were also very conscious of hiding information from among the layers of the architecture so that the IP packets, for the internet protocol packets, didn't have to know how they were being carried, so new technology could be swept in without changing that protocol. We also said that the little internet packets should be pretty stupid. They don't know what they're carrying. All they know is they're carrying bits, but they don't know what the bits mean. And that was good, because if you added a new application, all you had to do was reinterpret the bits at the edges of the net. You didn't have to change the network because the network didn't know and it didn't care. And so this kind of modularity and information hiding has been vastly helpful in allowing new applications to be built on the network. And so, of course, out of many, one, that is the internet. So I gave a version of this talk out at the Internet Archive at Brewster Kale's operation, which you should visit because it's an old Christian Science church. And he even has the pews are still there, and in the back he has all the petabytes of memory that are stored away with the flashing lights. And he has a whole bunch of mannequins that are sitting on the pews. And he moved them off to the right and left so that we had our meeting, real live people could be sitting in the pews. I only accepted questions from the mannequins on the left and right, safety measure. So I've been thinking a little bit about what kinds of technology we have to incorporate into our thinking for digital preservation. Compression schemes in order to use the least amount of space, tarball and things like that, which are common. And we need to store and recover. Up until now, this notion of compression and everything else involves particular objects that get stored and then fully recovered. But the World Wide Web is a much more complex thing because it's got pages that point to other pages. It's a complex. It's a web. And so figuring out how to retain that part in addition to the particular objects is important. So just preserving a web page with its HTML without the ability to go where the links went or to go to a place that replicates where the links went means that we have a very static representation of the net. We don't understand its connectivity. And we obviously have to think about web pages that change over time. So how do we keep track of which versions we're looking at? The programmers do this all the time with Programmers Workbench and things of that sort. So this World Wide Web is a really complex reference structure, so we have to deal with that. So Brewster Kahle has been running the Internet Archive for at least 15 years, maybe more, 20. And it's taking snapshots of the World Wide Web and storing them away. It's indexed in time, so you can actually has a Wayback Machine that lets you see what the web looked like at a certain year or a certain month. He also has to do something with the hyperlinks, because it's pretty clear that if you just copied the page and its hyperlinks 10 years from now, or maybe even tomorrow, clicking on the link might fail because the destination isn't available anymore. So he has to convert the hyperlinks into something that he can point to inside the space of his Internet Archive. So he has to essentially virtualize all of that. So it's a self-contained system. And he has to be crawling the web constantly, just like we do at Google, to create the index. And then there's this question of when is a page new? And you certainly wouldn't want pages to be snapshot every time you change one character. So we have to have some kind of a notion about publishing of a page, saying, I now want this page version to be seen by everybody. So that's an instant in time that should mark when you want to capture the web, that web page. And then I keep thinking about trying to capture everything that's on the web, and I thought about that philosophical problem, do the set of all sets contain itself? And I decided not to think about that anymore because it gave me a headache. So I'm sorry, you might want to get a cup of coffee. So I worry also about the amount of space required to retain the evolving web, its history, because it can barely contain itself as it is. I mean, there's, all this space is taken up by all these web pages. And so there's this idea of lots of copies keep things safe, but I'm kind of worried about how much storage we actually can afford to retain over long periods of time. So we have to be thoughtful about that. I'll come back to digital object identifiers when I give my Vint-Cerf version of Bob Kahn's talk. And then there is this other question about HTML, which itself has been evolving. It's gone from the original HTML to various versions to XML to HTML5 and so on. It's going to keep changing too. And so whatever we do in terms of archiving is going to have to take that into account, because the HTML of the web pages is going to change over time, and our ability to interpret that is going to have to keep up with that evolutions. And then I go back to permissions and access control. Some contents may be access controlled now for copyright reasons or for monetary reasons, and yet 100 years from now, those constraints may no longer be valid, and we have to understand when it's going to be okay to make access open. And so this creates a fairly complex environment where we literally have to keep track of the access controls and rights of every one of the objects pointed to in the archive. So I keep thinking about how to make this more automatic. And one possibility is that while you're creating web pages and launching them by saying, I want to publish, is that the environment that we use to say, and oh, by the way, this page now needs to be archived? And can we make that a kind of a standard and cooperative practice? I keep thinking about Google Docs, and one of the interesting things about Google Docs is that we replicate these across our multiple data centers to keep from losing anything. We actually also allow multiple parties to edit these documents at the same time, which is absolutely amazing, and that we don't get confused and lose things. But the idea of replicating over multiple storage environments is going to have to be part of this archival process as well. Then we have this problem of making references to the various objects. And so the web archiving entities, whoever they are, may need to have some common reference space so that each of them can ingest and correctly regurgitate pages on demand. So if they don't have a common reference frame, reference terminology, and reference space, that won't work. And so I keep thinking that Google, does this sharding thing where we take objects and we break them all up and spread them across multiple sites in the Google Drive. And I'm hoping that I can convince some of the Google executives that we should be a party to this as well. So here's some more thinking out loud. Some of you will be familiar with publish and subscribe protocol regimes. And this feels to me like it might be a place where that notion could be used as part of the archiving process. I declare this web page now archivable, and so please publish that fact to the archiving community. Some of them may ingest the pages, some may not. They may choose to ingest pages of certain type or certain content. We want that to be flexible so that we don't force every archive to archive everything, but we want it to be rich enough that we can archive almost everything over the sum of all of the archiving processes. Plainly, we need a lot of metadata, and so we'll have to have a way to express that. We'll have to have agreements about how that gets captured and how it gets interpreted. And then there's this rendering of the digital objects, and whether it's just presenting them or interacting with them, we have to have all the software that's needed in order to do that, and that has to be preserved over a period of time, again, and back to the virtual machine notion. And then there's this permission to use question. How do we represent that? How do we validate parties who are accessing the content? At what point can we say the content is no longer controlled and protected because its copyrights have expired or other rights are no longer valid? So if we're trying to surf the self-archiving web, one question is, which of the archives do we go to when we make a page reference? And figuring out how to resolve to multiple targets is another part of this problem, because there should be multiple targets. If I go to a particular web page that I'm trying to get to, I should have the resolution system should give me different choices, because there should be multiple places where I can go to get that content. Otherwise, we're back at risk that that one place goes away. How newspapers and magazines and books are snapshots of a particular work in time. We have editions of newspapers, we have editions of magazines. I kind of wonder at what rate we should be snapshotting the World Wide Web. And I don't know the answer to that. Probably part of it is the rate at which things are changing determine how often we should snapshot. But I'd really rather have a clue that something is worth snapshotting as opposed to simply taking a million pictures, hoping some of them are appropriate. So what else? Well, properties that would be attractive, automatic archiving when you declare that you're publishing. Is it a service that you sign up for? How is that funded? What about registering the software that's needed to interpret the web pages and a permission system that goes with it? And now what do we do about stuff that turns out to be malware? Do we want to archive that? And if we do, if we archive it, do we have a way to mark it so that if you're going in the archive, you don't accidentally ingest a serious virus or something because you were out there in the digital stacks? So we may want that, for history purposes to understand what the threats were in this online environment, but we also have to protect people. So we have to recognize what we're doing. And then there's this fidelity of the experience in the online environment. One thing is just to look at the web page itself without actually being able to execute any of the links. But something deeper than that is the ability to actually exercise the web page as it would have been when it was running. So what happens once a page is archived? Do we make sure that it's indelible? Do we do digital signatures on it to make sure that it can't be changed? That might turn out to be important, because in a court case, you don't want somebody to say, my web page had the following things on it in 1997 or 2005. But you can change it in order to, modify the court's decisions. You don't want that to happen if you're going to attribute to the storage system legal validity. What about if we make the self-archiving web work, will some of the records be considered official records like the ones that go into the National Archive? What happens if the content's encrypted? So now we have some problem because we can't see it unless we have the keys, but where do we store the keys and who's responsible for key management? And anybody who's ever forgotten their password will appreciate how hard it is to keep keys around for decrypting content. And then there's this access control question that keeps coming up all the time. So I know some of you will have some familiarity with the notion of containers that's starting to come along in the online cloud environment. Containers are actually kind of interesting because they are a way of boxing together everything you need in order to execute something. So it's very much like the digital vellum environment that I imagine. And so it could be that we have in our hands some technology that will help us do this automatic archiving and rendering of the web over time because the container has everything in it that we need to do that. There are some other projects that you all know about, and we've already mentioned some of them anyway, but the Internet Archive being obvious. The Library of Alexandria in Alexandria, Egypt is one of the backup sites for the Internet Archive. I think there's something delicious about that. It seems very appropriate. Ismail Serageldin is the librarian there. He's soon to retire, he says. A big loss in my view. But it's important that whatever we do, that we have multiple archives for this content. The Computer History Museum has been saving software as well as computing artifacts. Software is being saved in the Internet Archive. Google has been scanning books, and the Cultural Institute has been capturing images from many, many museums around the world. And then finally, there's the digital object architecture that Bob Kahn has worked on. And with permission, I'd like to give you a brief rendering of that concept, because I believe it plays and can play a very important role in the implementation of the self-archiving web. So in order to do that, I need to go pick up these slides. Now, I should warn you that this is me trying to channel Bob Kahn, and so I'm not sure that I will do this beautifully, but I will try. So the first thing is that this digital object architecture uses the term handle system. Handles are kind of like domain names. They're references to digital objects. And once you have this handle, when you resolve it, it takes you to or points you to that digital object. So the handle is a permanent thing that's assigned, doesn't get changed, never gets reassigned to anything else, and in theory doesn't disappear. This stuff is in use, so I am not speculating at this point. I'm telling you about something which is actually functioning and in use, and you can see a list here which I won't read to you. So the important part here is that stuff that works is really important. I mean, it's sort of like the internet. Things that work persist, and I'm hoping that the handle system will have that property as well. So there's pieces in this architecture. There's the client that's trying to get access to an object by way of a handle. There is discovering what resources are available down in the lower left. Where can I go in order to get things? How do I find something? So I need a resolution system in the lower right for you. And then finally, you want to go to a place where the objects are located. And so this is a very simple conceptual architecture made up of these four components. So here's an object. It's in the architecture. The digital object is in the architecture as a first-class citizen in the internet. So the notion of digital object becomes a first-class concept. So we want to be able to take these objects as objects, move them around, store them away, recover them, interpret them, and so on. These things could be quite complex. They can have all different kinds of content in them. It could be video, it could be audio, it could be a mix of that, it could be executables. Virtually anything you can digitize should be implementable as a digital object. And the whole idea behind the handle system is that it helps you find where is it and what am I allowed to do with it. So here's a digital object. It has information in it. It has a type of content. It has a unique identifier, and it responds to requests to render itself, for example, or to deliver some content. And it gets distributed. So here's an example. Here's Hamlet, which is a work, and it's got data elements in it. It's got content types, and they're all interconnected with each other. They could be rendered as print. They could be rendered on, well, I guess Bob intended scrolls? I don't know. Can you imagine reading Hamlet on a scroll? Okay. Doing somebody else's slides is sort of like delving into their psychology. And that's why I never let anybody read my code, right? Because they can tell everything about my head by looking at how I write software. So we have this unique identifier. They reference sequences of typed bytes. So there's types associated with the digital content of the objects. And it might have more than one content type. So there's an identifier. The identifier has a bunch of content in it. The handle service helps us find it in a repository somewhere. And that's basically all there is to it. Well, there's more. This is theorem number 206, which reads, everything is more complicated. And the closer you look at anything, the more complicated it gets. So this is sort of the full rendering of the handle service, which is helping you find the objects and maybe even search by type. You might only want to look for video. You might only want to look for print material and so on. So here's a kind of, I don't know, that's probably not even readable. It's so small. But the idea here is to take a web page, for example, and capture all of its data and metadata and store it away as a digital object. So the publisher produces content, it gets stored away, or it is presented to the collection service along with its metadata. Handle data is generated and stored away in the handle system so you can find it again. The metadata gets stored away elsewhere, and the handle system can help you find it after that. So a repository is where you store this stuff. It provides for dynamic acquisition, so new things can come into the repository, and an execution capability, so the code that implements the different kinds of content renderings can be executed in that environment. And it has an access protocol called Repository Access Protocol, surprisingly. And that's a standard. And so this allows multiple repositories to be created and to be part of the environment. So there's the client wrapping with the repository, so to speak. So the handle system itself is distributed. So this is the thing that takes a handle, resolves it, and tells you where to go and what to do. And there are a variety of different transformations. A handle could turn into a domain name, for example, or it could turn into something that points directly into a repository. It's all well defined. And so the client goes to the handle services, and there is a global handle resolution system and local handle resolution system. So you can have handles resolved locally, and if they don't know what to do locally, then they go to the global handle resolution system in order to get further data. It's a little bit like the root system of the domain name environment. So you can see these things distributed. The local handle resolution systems can also be replicated in multiple sites. And finally, we get actual objects that are part of that system. So here's an example. The handle might contain information in it that's of URL type, and the data is a familiar URL. But there are lots of other possibilities here. One of them might be the digital library system type of data, which has a reference, which is different from domain names or URLs, or the handle system administration system. So you have a variety of possibilities here, including extensions. So it could be XYZ handle type, and it has a certain binary representation, and it gets interpreted on the basis of what that handle type is. So some libraries that actually implement this stuff will be reachable through the web, for example, or more directly from digital library services using the repository access protocol. So a library could be a first-class object in this repository system, or it might be reached through the World Wide Web through a web server which knows how to talk to a repository, and then the repository responds with content. And that actually was the last slide, believe it or not. So I'm happy to just stop here. I realize that I may have even overstayed my welcome because it's after 10 o'clock. What does one mean? I can have one question? No? Oh, okay. So, well, I'll tell you what, if you have questions, I will do my best to answer them. Do we have roving microphones, or do I run around? Okay. So let me warn you that I'm hearing impaired, and what that means, I'm not the guy that came to talk and wouldn't listen. That's not my problem. But I may have to run around to lip read if necessary. So let's try, and if I'm having trouble hearing the question, I may leap off the stage, in which case the guys who are videotaping this will have a great time trying to figure out how to find me hiding behind the columns here in this perfectly structured room for lectures. Okay, so there's a question over here, but the microphone is over that way. So we'll get you, you're number 2. Just remember your number. First question.
Thank you. That was very interesting. I was going to ask about portable data and the role of that. I mean, right now you can't dump everything you've ever posted on Facebook or all your emails from Gmail into a folder, or perhaps transfer it to another service in the future.
Let's stop, because I am getting about 40% of this. Hold on. Sorry, fellas.
Okay, yeah. I'm going to ask, portable data, what is the role of portable data in basically transferring your data from one service to another, or even backing it up on a hard drive?
Somehow this isn't working the way I was expecting it to work. Okay, this is part of my health plan. I think everybody understands that. So, storing all of the data that you have, first of all, we don't have common standards across all of those various services, which is a pity. I mean, I think we should, but we don't. And so pulling all that stuff into your own hard drive gives you the problem that you don't have enough room to store it. So this leaves you with a couple of possibilities. One is you ingest all this stuff, and then you push it in opaque form into some, cloud-based storage system, whether it's, AWS or Google or something else. That has to be the worst possible outcome, because it's not structured, it's not properly curated, it's just there in an opaque form, and only you can retrieve it. That might be great for privacy, but it's not a good thing for historical purposes. And so we could argue whether all that stuff is worth saving or not. And some people will say it isn't worth saving, and so stop worrying about it. But I would argue two things. One, if you think it's important to save, you should have mechanisms for saving it in a way that's useful, possibly for historians. And the second observation, again, is that we don't always know what's important and what isn't. So again, though, I think if you're the creator of content, in a sense, you should have the choice of whether it gets saved or not. Once you publish it, though, in an environment which is open, which is true of much of the web today, and I hope it stays that way, you've sort of committed yourself to history whether you like it or not. And I think that has to be thought about. Once we demonstrate the capability to archive this, people who produce content should be well aware that it might be archived. And maybe that will cause people to think twice about what they put up on the net. Okay, we have time for one more, do you think? Okay, this gentleman over here. No, actually, the guy behind you. Yeah. Yeah, I'm sorry, he was number 2.
Oh.
He had his hand up first. I'll take a third question. whether Wendy wants me to or not. Yes, okay, go ahead.
Thank you very much. So you made a really, really nice point, is that we need... I'll wait for him to do the mic. So we need multiple...
This isn't a microphone.
We just have a one-to-one.
All right, here's another microphone.
Okay, so we need multiple, like you said, archives, and that's the kind of future potentially. We're going to be doing it. Everyone's going to be archiving. But what's the kind of... do you perceive a mechanism to emerge from these multiple archives to allow the kind of distributed approach to discover them? Is this something that's going to be organic, or is this something that's got to be a top-down kind of layer that's going to be enforced by someone?
I hope not. It would be... I guess I can do it this way now, okay. Except I'm hiding from the camera. Okay, all right. So first of all, it would be a pity if we were to rely on some top-down thing. It works so much better when you have an architecture and a set of protocols and design that allows people who wish to commit to this to be able to do so. And so I'm much more interested in getting the technology into people's hands, maybe built in as part of the web environment. That's why the self-archiving web notion is so appealing to me. You don't think about it, it just archives itself automatically. You need to say whether you are turning on or turning off the archiving mechanism. Business models are going to be really important here. I have an acquaintance who is starting a company called Immortal, and it's all about trying to preserve digital content for families in the future. And he was trying to figure out a business model for this, and he came up with a very interesting idea. You all know about life insurance, right? You know how this works? You pay until you're dead. I don't know of any other product that has that proper... Maybe some of the drug companies have that. So what if you had a kind of data life insurance thing where you pay to save your data over a period of time, and you accumulate what is needed in order to what's the right word for this? Endow the archival process so that it can be paid for over a period of time. Now, I have no idea if that idea is actually going to work or not, but this notion of providing a business model is pretty important. Again, I don't think we want to save information by accident. We want to have mechanisms that are self-supporting over the long term. Okay, maybe one more and that's it? Yeah. Okay. Okay, go for it. Use this one.
University of Southampton, Ramin's ex-PhD supervisor. So you talked a lot about technologies of preservation, and yet they really depend on kind of a social infrastructure of organisations and institutions that care about preservation. You have a few of them here, the Library of Congress, the British Library, and yet they're too thin on the ground perhaps for us to do the job. And it seems to me that on the whole society cares about preservation after we've lost something in order to prevent it. And I just wonder where that conundrum comes, because where we have a private institution that attempts to resurrect information and preserve it, I take the example of the Google Books, for example, then other stakeholders who see value potentially start to fight back against the preservation actions. So how do we address this conundrum of getting people to care but not care enough to stop us doing it?
So, in fact, the answer may very well be that we don't do that. Let me explain. Let's imagine, for the sake of argument, that the World Wide Web becomes a self-archiving system. What is the implication of that? The implication is that the same parties that provide you with the method for producing your Twitter pages and your blogs and all these other things are also engaged in the archiving process. You know, think for a minute, they have a business model that whether it's advertising or you pay or something else. And so the question is whether we could induce into the system the archiving process as the normal part of the way it works, as opposed to separating it as an act that's distinct. And you know, the more we keep thinking about it's an act that's distinct, the harder we make the problem. But if we incorporate this into the normal process and replication becomes part of the normal process, we may actually end up with a self-archiving environment that works and is supported because there's already a business model for the generation of the data. Why not incorporate into that this preservation as well? Now, I just said something that might be really hard to implement, but it's not crazy because if you think about it, none of the things that are on the web today were there before until somebody decided they wanted to make a business of doing it. And so let's see if we can't build preservation into the norm as opposed to making it a special action of only a few parties. End of story. Okay. We got one more.
I wanted to lead the applause here, but before we let Vint go, we're going to have a coffee break now. We'll be back here at 10:45 to start the panels and presentations. If you're standing at the back, there's a room downstairs with the webcast going with seats. So feel free to use that if you want to. I just want to say a big thank you to Vint for making the effort to come here today. And as ever, I'm bowled over by some of the things he says. I think I'm immersed in this world, and he just has so much insight. Digital vellum is now my favourite phrase. You haven't trademarked it, have you? No.
No.
And I'm not going to, it's all right. It's just and also the idea of the self-archiving web. I think this is an amazing way of capturing everything that we're trying to talk about. And the fact that Vint is still coming up with all these new ideas that leave the rest of us just completely gobsmacked is quite amazing. So let's once more thank Vint very much for just being Vint.
Thank you.
Now is the time to hear about what happened at the hackathon, or I like to call them datathons. Doesn't really matter. Well, they're now forever called Archives Unleashed in this context. And we had a wonderful 2 days with people from all over the world, actually, who came to work with the data. I'm not going to tell you about it. I'm going to introduce you to the team who ran it. You've got their bios in the pack. To Ian Milligan, Jimmy Lin, and Matt Webber, my co-host for today as well. So, Ian, I think you're first up. Ian, over to you.
Thank you.
A round of applause for Ian.
Thank you very much. I'll just start by, could we get our 4 other speakers up? We'll just make them sit in these bright lights at the front of the stage. And that way we can be a bit quicker. I think we'll need Dan as well up here. Hi, my name is Ian Milligan. I'm an assistant professor of history at the University of Waterloo. And Jimmy, Matt, myself, and a few other organizers I'll show you just spent the last few days running a datathon here at the Library of Congress. The first question I want to do before we get into the nitty-gritty is just rhetorically talk a little bit about why I think these sorts of events are important. And the question I like to ask is, why is a historian helping to organize a datathon around web archives? And I think it's because, in short, as we've heard earlier today from Vint and we'll be hearing today, we have a problem facing our collective cultural heritage. This is a big issue that we need to be involved in. And when I go on talks and try to sum it up to audiences, I like to encapsulate the problem and the opportunity facing us in something as innocuous as this, a page from geocities.com. Geocities.com, founded in 1994, deleted in 2009, saved thanks to web archivists, was the kind of place where you could go and create your own website about anything that you so desired. You'd go to geocities.com, type in your email address, get your free megabyte, 2 megabytes, eventually 10 megabytes of content. Whoopee. And it was a big deal. And you could create a site about anything that you wanted. You could create your love site to Buffy the Vampire Slayer, your lamentation about the Toronto Maple Leafs, your family tree, your love of Winnie the Pooh if you're a 12-year-old child. And people took that to an extreme, and people jumped on board with such aplomb. And I love this visualization because it shows just how quickly people took to creating content and leaving it behind on the World Wide Web. GeoCities.com had its first 10,000 users in October of 1995, 100,000 in August of 1996, 1 million in October 1997, and by its deletion in 2009, some 7 million people had created web pages on GeoCities.com. And when today we want to go through and see how many URLs exist, it's something like 186 million URLs. GeoCities.com, a tiny slice of the web of the 90s and the 2000s, accounts for this much information. And as a historian, that fascinates me. It boggles the mind. It means that we are operating on a different scale of the preservation of everyday people. The example I like to make, just to bug my colleagues who do British history mostly, is to say, let's take your golden, your treasure trove of historical information. If you want to study the 19th century or the 18th century and see what it was like to be an everyday person, say in London, you've almost no information. You only have information when people come into contact with the state or the church, or if an accident happens and something is left behind. And so for many historians, they reconstruct that sort of life through court transcripts like the Old Bailey Online, which between 1674 and 1913 collected 197,000 trials. They described their site as, quote unquote, the largest body of sources ever created by non-elite people. And that's true until something like GeoCities. In short, historians are moving from scarcity, where we used to have no information about the past, to abundance, where we have too much. That I like to present this as the problem with the Old Bailey was that you always wished you had more information, and the problem with GeoCities is that you wish you had less. And so that's why we do these datathons. Our animating statement is that web archives are great. They present a tremendous opportunity. It makes my skin chilled when I think about them. But access and usage of web archived content remains a very considerable problem. And so we bring people together to run these datathons. Over the last few days, we brought together an interdisciplinary team to bring together international participants here. And it's a team of a historian, a communication studies scholar, Natalie, who you'll hear from shortly, a computer scientist, Jimmy, who's in this room, Matt Weber, who you'll be hearing from this afternoon, and Nicholas Warby, a librarian who selfishly is getting married tomorrow and had to go back to Toronto. But we'll send him our congratulations from afar. What did we aim to accomplish over the last 3 days? Well, we wanted to build community, a community of people who can use web archives to answer interesting questions about the past and today. We wanted to articulate a common vision of web archiving development and tool development. We wanted to avoid the black boxes of search engines that we don't understand. We don't want to design search engines where I type in a keyword and it goes through billions of files and gives me 10, and I don't know why I got those 10. And most importantly, we want to equip us as a collective, and that's not the people in the room datathoning, and also, I think, our society to deal and work with born digital cultural resources. So, datathons are tricky, and we call them datathons. It's a bit less scary than hackathon, but we really try to bring together diverse perspectives. We try to bring together people who can hack, who have the technical chops to write code, make dreams a reality, but also those with theoretical ideas. They want to talk, have conversations, think about the ethics, the standards, etc. And so our datathon really tries to balance the perspectives of humanists like myself and computer scientists and social scientists who are also in the room. What did we do in a very quick nutshell? Well, on Monday, it's hard to believe that was Monday, we gathered at George Washington University Library to form teams, a great sticky note exercise, thinking about data sets people wanted to use, questions they might have. We framed the problem, we socialized. We do a lot of socializing if you come to our hackathons. Then in this room on Tuesday at the Library of Congress, we had quick presentations, we solidified our teams, and really we just started datathoning. It was just a buzz of activity as people worked away. We had incredible catering. If you want to run an event, this is a plug for the Library of Congress. They are the best event staff ever. We got like a bucket of M&Ms here. I don't know if that's healthy, but it was good. Mostly it was just quiet work, hacking, data flowing, and some awesome results that I'm really happy to be able to share with you in just a minute. And then, of course, today we're here wrapping it all up. The projects, we had basically 8 major projects, which I'll talk about. We didn't have time to bring all 8 teams up here to share the results, unfortunately, due to time constraints. So I'm going to talk about 4, and then we have these 4 poor people in the hot seats who are going to share their projects with very strict 3-minute time limits. But I have the pleasure to talk about a few quick projects. So one team here looked at Twitter, and they took a large data dump of Twitter and asked, what is the source of the narratives in election-related tweets? And so here we're seeing they took 327,000 tweets, hashtagged with election 2016, the real Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton account, 7,000 URLs, and we can see topics relating to the Russian DNC hack, the Trump revoking the Washington Post credentials, and the case of Omar Mateen's wife of the Orlando shooting. And we're just seeing those surges in activities over time. A team took the IMLS museum data set, this monumental sort of terabytes and terabytes of American museums, and tried to figure out what you could do with the lightweight finding aid files that drive it, the CDX files that give context to web archives. And it was amazing. I mean, here we're seeing a domain map of the American museum space, and we also saw interesting things looking at what different file formats speak to different types of content. There was a team called the Supremes, it was a great name, and they used the Library of Congress web archiving collection. They used websites collected around the nomination of Alito and the nomination of Justice Roberts, took those websites and did things like extracting the links and seeing what websites link to other websites. Who do discussions on the Senate link to? Where do discussions on the House link to? And also did quite a bit of content analysis, taking the text and visualizing it in new ways. Their take home they wanted me to emphasize was know your data. What are your assumptions? They generated this great graph. It shows yay, that's about Roberts. I told them to lie. That's a great visualization because he was confirmed. And they tell me it was actually, they were scraping in the Library of Congress tons and tons of yays and nays roll calls. So their message was, you have to know your data. And then finally, there was a team, Campaign Origins, a research question, where did the topics in election-related Twitter conversations originate? And they topic modeled, in this case, Donald Trump's information, and we saw that it was his birthday a few days ago. And those were our quick little teams. I might be missing one. And then I'm just going to turn us over here to our 4 lightning talks. And so we have them in order. Team Mojitos, Team I Know What You Hid Last Summer, Team Turtle, and then Team Counterterrorism. So we'll go in that order, and I'll get my little timer out. So thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. Our team worked with a dataset of websites collected from the Cuban domain by the Internet Archive. We started with big expectations. We wanted to work on a period of 14 months and detect all media events in this dataset. In the end, we worked on 1 day, 1 event. But we had lots of fun solving the problems, the many problems that we were confronted with. So we decided to work on understanding how Barack Obama's visit to Cuba last March was covered in the news in Cuba and compare pro-Cuban regime media with Cuban media in exile. So we decided to also narrow down our sample to the major Cuban newspaper called Granma, which is the official voice of the Communist Party, assuming that in the context of freedom of the press in Cuba, the other news outlets would likely repeat the same arguments as Granma. And the other news source that we used is newspaper called El Nuevo Herald, which is based in Miami. So we started to work with WARC files, which are very heavy files, and we encountered technical problems doing that. So we find another solution, which is that we scraped from the web all of the web pages that we wanted from these 2 sources, and we organized them in a database that allowed us to do some text processing analysis. Except it didn't work so well, of course. we had problem with collecting dates. So for grandma, it was very easy because the date was in the URL, so that was very plain and simple. But with El Nuevo Herald, the date was not in the URL, so we thought we're going to crawl the text and, and then find the, and then assume that the date will be always on top of the title, but it was not the case. The date was moving on the page, so we had to find a way to find the pattern of the date in the HTML that we extracted. So then we worked on entity linking to find semantic similarities, text processing to find mentions and co-occurrences of words, such as US, Cuba, Obama, and Castro. And we used Gephi to visualize the results in the form of a graph. In the end, we managed to produce one graph that is a final graph on the left here. And instead of taking a top-down approach of trying to impose a list of words that we wanted to find, we favored an inductive bottom-up approach because we wanted to let the data talk to us. So we defined the event of the visit as a co-occurrence graph centered around prominent entities. And one of the other challenge, 1 minute, okay, one of the other, 0? Okay. And this is what we would have liked to do, which is a timeline, and we wanted to detect similarities in events over a period of time. Thank you very much.
It's incredible what they can do in 2 days and what they can do in 3 minutes. So, our next team here, I know what you hid last summer.
Well, so for our project, we came together around sort of the nebulous concept of what are the ethical implications of using web archives and working with web archives. And then we realized we had 2 days, and we realized that we also wanted to work with data. So our story is as much about the process and the interdisciplinary work and what happens when an information scientist, communications, web sciences, computer science comes together and tries to make a project. So instead of sort of having more of a theoretical foundation, more of a theoretical expression of our project, we decided to sort of express the ethics and sort of our approach to our project. So what we started, we used the UK elections 2015 Twitter dataset with the hashtags GE 2015 and GE from February 27th to May 8th of 2015. And we limited the data set specifically to members of parliament in the UK who were tweeting during that time, because we felt that this concept of publicness of a public official and the publicness of their content, right, and believing that's sort of an appropriate place to look and thinking of it, we're taking an ethical stance, a clear ethical stance here, in that the general population, are we allowed to use their data? What are the ethical implications of that? So we're actually specifically making that choice. So what we did was we grabbed these, we had this collection of tweets, we went through and parsed them, we extracted all the URLs that were linked, because what we wanted to do is see what happens when we take a Twitter data set and then we layer on top of that a web archive. How do those connect? What's the sort of flow on top of that? So then once we grabbed those URLs, we looked at the current status. Are those currently available, not currently available? And then we searched the Internet Archive for these URLs to see were these actually archived. So you can think of this as kind of the process. That sort of top line, you'll see from the 27th to the 8th of May, that sort of green line with the floating tweet flag, that's when the tweet happened, but you'll see that some of these pages were archived, and you'll see that there are various archives, which are those red dots. So a tweet happened, and a URL might have been archived 20 days before that, might have been archived 2 days after that, another 3 or 4 days, another 5 days, right? So we have multiple copies of that archive. So we had, of the tweets, we started with 2.9 million, and we ended up with 12,357 tweets by members of parliament. Of that, 7,818 tweets had URLs. We deduplicated, and that's about 6,700. There are lots of get out to vote tweets. Come on, vote, right? Of those, about 1,335 were currently accessible. About 113 of those were 404'd. And so what that sort of means in our work is that Well, linking is a pervasive practice on Twitter, and it's a pervasive practice within UK MPs. Also, we did a qualitative analysis of about 10% of that content, and what MPs are linking to are the party page, the party Twitter account, or pages supporting a specific agenda. So part of this sort of documentation of as that agenda changes, that's one of the cases where web archives could become very important. And we felt that a URL is an integral part of a social media post. So if you read the social media post without the link, that's problematic. I'm done. All right.
So now we have Team Turtle to share their results.
All right, so there's a couple of jokes for why we're named Team Turtle. We work slow, but we're steady, and we also work in the shell, as my colleague mentioned. That's a programming joke, so, but I'll just dive right into it. So we actually received 145 ARC files from the Library of Congress, and they told us right away that this was really messy data and that we're going to have a lot of trouble, so good luck with that. The research question that we wanted to tackle was which places and topics did the two candidates in the 2004 election talk about most, and did this actually correlate with the election results? So our methodology was, first we cleaned up these messy ARC files using the work-based platform, and then we extracted the named entities through the candidate names and the state names. And then we applied the topic modeling, LDA, TF-IDF, and we also had a semantic web extension using the Google Knowledge Graph API, and also further applications to Wikidata. So this is kind of our result. The size of the circles represent how often the candidate would talk about this state or this locale. And actually, if you hover over it, you can actually see the topics that were talked about most often. So hovering over there, it shows Iraq was talked about very frequently by that candidate. And then extending this further, because we're using topic modeling, we can actually hook into all the knowledge in the knowledge graph and the related semantic web data. So what we created was a Python CLI where we could query the Google Knowledge Graph, and then what we got back was actually this unique identifier, which is the freebase mid. And this is actually the same graph database that powers all of those queries you can send to Google, such as where is the Library of Congress, and it can tell you. This is the same data that we're querying. And because Freebase is shut down and we can't access it anymore, the best alternative right now is to access Wikidata and query the graph database there. So this is our project in 3 minutes. Thank you.
That was actually 2 minutes, which is astounding. So, and don't worry, we're going to put this up on the web, and I'll let you all know soon. So then last but not least, we have our winning team, Team Counterterrorism.
Thanks. So as Vint Cerf told us, the internet was designed in 1973 to be able to allow anybody who can follow the protocols to play whether they're a future friend or a foe. So it's basically viewpoint neutral. So packets don't really care, what your intent is with that data. And you could argue maybe preservation should also be viewpoint neutral, and I assume is. So everyone in here is obviously using the internet for the good, but there are folks out there who are using it to try to recruit for violent extremist groups across the globe. So I discovered a shared interest with another collaborator here. So this is what you get when you put together a political scientist, a software developer, and a librarian, only in 2 people. So what we did was, my collaborator, Emily from University of Washington, brought her great art chops as well as an ideology classifier that had been used to try to categorize all the cacophony of different groups in Syria based on text from their web and radio transcripts. And I had a set of tweets that we've been collecting at GW using the social feed manager on behalf of the program on extremism that is following 300 American and US-based suspected ISIS sympathizers. So it's a pretty large body of tweets. There are a lot more accounts than people because these folks tend to jump around, so that presents its own challenges in doing analysis. So what we did was we tried to apply the ideology scoring methodology to this body of data of tweets. And we were able to get that to work on a small set, but I think we need a little more power to crunch through more data. So the other thing we did was we used some basic just Python scripting to extract the user mentions from those tweets and output that as CSV of edges based in graph theory. So if somebody is mentioning in their tweets a couple other people, so you have two edges right there. And what we wanted to do was see if similarity of ideology is related to the likelihood that they'll interact, and that can help us understand the relationships between these people and how they're using Twitter to try to recruit. So we fed those through some R scripts, and what we were hoping to do was get to be able to evolve the network over time. I had a little fight with Gephi. It was just, there was too much data for one afternoon. We had about 500,000 edges in the graph. And there's also the issue that one account is not one person. So what we did was we fed it into R and took at least one snapshot to show you. And it actually validated what our colleagues on the program Extremism have noticed anecdotally, which is that there are really two types of users involved in these networks, which are, there are a few people who are originating content and a lot of basically amplifiers. So we'd like to follow up and do this on a larger scale. You can see some of the other things we'd like to do, but we feel there's a lot of potential here.
More importantly, this is just a flavor. So we're going to put all the projects up at archivesunleashed.com, put that in your notes. We're going to have all those projects up very shortly, and you can get to know the people who were involved in the projects, what they were able to achieve. And I was thinking there's someone from Wikimedia taking photos in here, because he said, you know, you don't have a photo of young Einstein. Well, there's a bunch of young Einsteins here at this datathon. So if you're looking for great people, you know where to find them. Just before we turn it over, we might have time for one question. I just have to do some very important thanks. So none of this would have been possible without the Library of Congress, for their logistical support, for their beautiful facilities and room, for their data, for everything, basically. The National Science Foundation generously supported it, and it made it possible for us to bring in graduate students from all over the United States to come and attend the Datathon. Very important to develop junior scholars. And the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada provided travel funding and food for graduate students and postdoctoral fellows to come from Canada and from places that are not the United States. So it really takes a whole army. You can see it on this slide here, you know, Internet Archive, George Washington University, Compute Canada, the Web Science Trust, Rutgers, University of Waterloo. It really did take a village to make this possible. So thank you very much, and do keep your eye on these scholars. It's going to be an incredible few years ahead, I know. So thank you. Yeah, I think we have 5 minutes until I get kicked off stage. So questions for me, but also questions for our friends on stage. Oh. So many mics.
It's Vince Cerf. Yeah, this is partly a question and partly a kind of a statement for your reaction. I am so impressed by what you are able to do with information in digital form. I know that sounds kind of stupid coming from me, but it's so different from picking up a book and reading it. And your ability to process this information differently from any other way we've done in the past seems almost dramatic. And so I'm actually curious to know whether you feel the same way, that this is a completely new way of understanding our knowledge.
If any of you want to take that? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm blown away by what we can do and what we can uncover about the past. And, you know, to me, it underscores the importance of the message that you bring, that we need to act to preserve this information, because if we have it, we can do incredible things with it. So, complete agreement. I think we have one over here.
Sorry, Liz Carr again. I run a doctoral training centre with lots of, with about 50 PhD students, and we're trying to train them up in these methods with access to data. What role, how can a body like the Library of Congress be useful, or the British Library? How can they help us to train students? How can they help students to research? What do you see their role as being?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so I thought they were going to answer all the questions, but now I am. And these lights are bright. I'm thinking, I mean, the role I think that they can provide is really, I've become a proponent of in-person training. So there's lots of stuff online, lots of training sites, and you can run through scripts. But nothing replaces the ability to go to a place like the British Library, which has data on site, has, British Library has incredible staff who can help, bring these things together, provide computing resources, provide people together, and let these sort of interdisciplinary hubs form. I think you have that at Southampton, but most of us, historians, are stuck talking to other historians, computer scientists are talking to other computer scientists, librarians are talking to other librarians. And by doing things on site, bringing together excellence, we can do things. I mean, the checklist to make these events successful has really been, food is always important, socializing is always important, but really having machines, like virtual machines to spin up. Someone has a question, they don't have to futz around with Amazon. We can here's the keys to a machine. Don't let that limit your dream. They're having a problem with Gephi getting a network going. Here's a network scholar. And just having that ability for them to watch someone do it, and you just see the gears click in their mind, and they can go back to their home campus, and eventually they'll run their own datathon. And it's like this virus that'll spread around the world. So that's my dream. Yeah,
I think also there's part of the institutions provide sort of endorsement in some ways of our work and legitimize some of the exploratory work that we're doing that some chunks of our field might see as unimportant or illegitimate. I also think that the view that institutions like the Library of Congress and the British Library and such bring, the long view of contextualizing provenance, preservation, the connectedness, and also maybe help decrease some of the sort of fetishizing of the technical, and also help us sort of contextualize and center us. So I think that there's a grounding that these institutions can provide that I think is really helpful, that as we innovate, it's also important for us to get some of the grounding from the institutions.
I think one of the other things that institutions like the Library of Congress and your institution can do are to take the lead in helping to resolve some of the gray areas of the ethical and legal issues in preservation or sharing this type of data. So in that role, these institutions can do it. A good example is what Internet Archive also has done in some of the areas that a few years ago were gray areas, and they've just done it in terms of taking lead and going ahead and preserving it. So I think that's a role that also the LOC and the British Library can do.
Great. Well, I think we're at 11:15, and we're going to be on time today. So thank you very much. Give them all a round of applause. Okay. So Jefferson's going to use my computer. I'm just going to queue it up for Jefferson then. Okay, so it's just queued up on here.
You're not taking this down, you're leaving this here? Yeah, okay. Okay then. So we move seamlessly on to our first panel of the day. Do you need? Okay. Where you? And my we move seamlessly on to our first. I want to thank Ian and Jimmy and Matt for that. I think this is, we were really pleased that we could run the Datathon back to back with this event. It's worked so well, and I think it's so important that as well as hearing from the wise ones, we get the next generation. These are the future, and these are the people that will actually carry the banner forward and do the most amazing things with the data that's coming out of these archives. And that's so, so important. And as we keep saying, it is institutions like the libraries that will be here and the universities that will be here for many years to come. When we were at George Washington University on Monday, they made the point how difficult it is to do interdisciplinary work. And you know, we've really forged ahead with this at Southampton, and it's really difficult in universities to bring different disciplines together, and this type of event can do that. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce one of my co-hosts for today, David Lazar from Northeastern University, who's going to chair this panel. David.
Thank you, Wendy, and thank you to the library. I think this is truly an awesome place, by which I mean it truly does inspire awe about the possibilities of human knowledge. And I'm just going to say a few words. I'm going to keep it short and sweet, and then I'll introduce our panel, or I'll introduce panelist by panelist. You know, I think a motivating example might be the election of 2016, right, which is an extraordinary election, and if one were to write up what has happened, I think you would just say it was implausible as a piece of fiction. And you know that there will be a best-selling book in 2116 when everyone has forgotten this election to say, you're not going to believe what the election of 2016 was like, right? And it is inconceivable that one could write such a history without extensive use of what is happening on the web, what is manifest, what is recorded. And indeed, the amount of information and possibilities that you have access to are incredibly more than one would have access to in, let's say, the election of 1860 today. And so, in part, the interesting challenge then becomes that we can't really save everything. In fact, in some sense, we can only save a tiny fraction of everything. And you know, I think of it as I'm a political scientist, so I'm not that historian. You know, I'll be long forgotten come 2116. But for me, as a political scientist, I think, wow, we can literally in principle, watch things spread real time. But we can watch snippets of text, of ideas spread through the internet. And so, but that's not something necessarily that can be done if we don't record the right kinds of information in the right places at the right temporal granularity. And so part of the question and part of why I hope we engage today in some fashion is the need for preservation, but the preservation of what, for what questions, which is an incredibly impossible question, really, in a way, because we can't even anticipate what the conceptual questions will be 2 years from now, 10 years from now, 100 years from now. We can't anticipate the analytic machinery that will be available, the development of theory. I think to address Surf's question earlier, you know, how does the digitization of things change things? It changes everything, right? Because, and I can't, I don't think we can even imagine, for example, for me as a social scientist, what the social sciences of a decade will look like. Because we can see different things, we will be able to imagine different things and imagine and construct theories in a way that's so removed from social sciences before the present. And so that's really the intellectual possibilities. I think I do want to throw out just one more notion of archiving, just while we're throwing out just sort of the notion of capturing what is out there on the web, is how do we capture the experiences of individuals? And I think that that there is the opportunity perhaps for what one might call citizen archiving, and we've touched a little bit on this, but you know, what are people reading online? That is, if you capture what is online, doesn't actually capture what people are looking at and who is looking at that. And so part of what I'd like to throw out there is the notion of a couple of notions. One is how do we interrogate people's experiences of the web in a way that is then captured in some enduring fashion. And some of that may literally be asking people about their experiences, but a lot of that may be also capturing just the digital traces of individuals' experiences on the internet. You know, do the people who look at the New York Times are the same people who watch Fox News? Probably not, right? But how do we know that? And how do we separate and sift through everything in a way that it captures our contemporary understanding of what the noise, where's the noise and where the signal is? Because we know, like with Twitter, and I'm a big fan of Twitter as a resource, but it's mostly garbage. I mean, you know, it's bots, it's heterogeneous, it's a lot of the analyses I look out there basically pulls together, you know, humans, regular people, journalists, politicians, and tons of bots, most of whom you don't know are bots, right? And then just sort of aggregate an analysis like those are all comparable things, right? That's a problem, right? And so there may be things we can do today in terms of sorting through this that will be impossible to do tomorrow. And so how do we build the tools that allows us to separate the wheat from the chaff when there's, you know, such a bad ratio to begin with? So I sort of like the notion of some way of interactively capturing people's experiences and saving that, of asking people about their experiences, and a lot of this is sort of a mashup of archiving and old school social science methods. And so I'm just going to throw that out as something to contemplate. But you know, I'm going to now shift to introducing. Well, I'll introduce our first panelist, Jeff Bailey. I think Jeff represents the internet.
Jefferson.
I'm sorry.
It's on the program.
I realized that as soon as I said that, and now that it's been taped and will be put up on the internet, it will be archived.
It's in the historical record.
That's right. So this goes to the point of noise being recorded. So Jefferson Bailey, and I knew that as soon as I said it. So my apologies, since my last name is always mispronounced, even by friends of decades. But Wendy did pronounce it correctly, so thank you. But Nash always gets it wrong, so. Jefferson flew out here from California, from the Internet Archive, where he's been working since 2014, and as has already been mentioned, the Internet Archive is one of the leading institutions for doing this. It was way ahead of the curve. And his work involves managing numerous web archiving services, and before that, he was involved in many initiatives around digital preservation in a variety of institutions and libraries, which is enumerated in the biographies here. So I'm going to shift the mic to Jefferson. So thank you.
All right, thanks, David. Okay, cool, it works. So hi, everyone. I am Jefferson Bailey, Director of Web Archiving Programs and Internet Archive. And first, obviously, just want to thank Wendy for putting on this awesome event, Kluge and LC for hosting, and also, of course, Ian and Matt and the whole Archives Unleashed team for doing the Datathon, actually the second one we've done. And it was really amazing over the course of the Datathon to see researchers actually using these web archives that often, some of them I had crawled myself entirely on a whim. So the historical record often is determined by areas of interest, and I was like, let's crawl every museum site, and people did some awesome stuff with the museum data. So Wendy sort of challenged us to do a little history, a little method, and then a little big picture stuff in a very short time frame. So I'm going to try to run through it pretty quickly. So folks that don't know the Internet Archive, we are a nonprofit library. We are in a church in San Francisco. It's open to the public please come by if you're in town. And we have been around, this is our 20-year anniversary, so there'll be some big events later in the year. And our mission is universal access to all knowledge. So we are not just an archive of web material, we actually have lots of digital content. You'll see all the stats there. The one, of course, most relevant to our talk today is our web archive, which is about to hit 50 billion captures. So we've been doing it since the beginning in 1996. We get about 1 billion captures. A capture is just a web resource per week, and a little over a petabyte per year in web data specifically. So we do have 25 petabytes of unique information of all variety, and a little over half of that is the web material. So here's sort of how our crawling and capture for web content has gone over the years. Obviously scaled up. I didn't actually put YouTube on there, but YouTube should be on the slide somewhere, since it, of course, audio, video, its migration to the web has really expanded storage needs for all web archives. So our crawling, I think, sometimes strikes people as being, it's one big crawl, and the Internet Archive just crawls everything. And it's actually much more dynamic. It's much more, I have the sort of constellation metaphor in my talk, and I'll cover a couple of the different methods, but it's actually, I call it multimodal crawling strategy. So we capture in many different ways, not just ourselves, but also working directly with partners. We do run big global crawls, both at a very wide and shallow level, and at a very deep and sort of well-scoped level. So there are global crawls, but other things we do are work with national libraries to capture country-level domains, so CCTLDs. So we've worked over the years with at least a dozen national libraries to get .something something, to get sort of a big capture of a specific country's web domain. We have collaborative collections, a couple of which I mentioned here, end-of-term web archive that we do with LC and a number of others, which is capturing a snapshot of the entire US federal government web domain at before and after every presidential transition. We capture things like orphan domains. People talked about the Cuba collection. We just decided to crawl .cu just because we could. Spontaneous events, of course. We're doing crawling around the Pulse event and have done it for all sorts of global events. And then, of course, we work directly with researchers, K-12 institutes, and partnerships with educational programs. And those are both to get subject experts to contribute seeds and URLs for us to crawl, and also, of course, to work with them in use of our archives. Another thing, I was really enamored of Vince's talk about the need for business models and especially sustainability around web archiving programs. Internet Archive has a quite popular web archiving subscription service that's used by almost 500 institutions, mostly libraries and archives in the academic realm, to create curated special collection of archives that they can then, of course, store and preserve locally themselves, as well as provide access through IA. So those are capture methods, access methods. Of course, most people are going to be familiar with the Wayback Machine. You can enter a URL and see its capture rate over time. Of course, the obvious example is an early capture of the Library of Congress website from 1999. Actually holds up in the sort of web design way, so props to LC. Of course, there's other types of collections too. So not just websites, but type of web content that you can then aggregate. So this is, of course, we just extracted a bunch of animated GIFs of puppies, because I really truly believe that the web would not be what it is without the ability to share dog photos. But it also sort of is indicative of the creative expression that's also in the web that we sometimes forget about when focusing on the scholarly record. Other access models like the hackathon or research partnerships to get our data out there and get people using it in different ways. So that's access methods, and then sort of technology and infrastructure methods. We are, of course, dedicated to open source software. Heritrix is a crawler, Wayback is the piece of software, and we are developing new methods of crawling technology to deal with the dynamic web in JavaScript, as well as more API-based infrastructure for interoperability across systems. And so when thinking about opportunities and challenges, we have this thing called the Do We Have It API, and it's basically just a big dump of all sorts sorts of identifiers from catalogs and ISBNs and things. And we can just hit it and see whether we have it in the archive. And I thought that was an interesting model for thinking about what we have and what we've sort of accomplished in web archiving and what we don't have and what are the current challenges. So we are content agnostic for acquisition of web material. It's print, it's audio video, it's code, it's CSS, all kind of thing. The web has consumed basically all methods of digital information delivery. So things that were not ever on the web, printed in digital form are now just going straight to the web. The legal issues, I think they still exist a little bit, but have been, I think we've made incredible progress, the whole community, over the years on this. When Internet Archive started, before my time, but people were like, oh my God, you can't capture it, and oh my God, you can't even replay it. How could you do that? It's not yours. But it is, of course, a public publishing platform, and I think advocacy around access has really grown over the years. Time travel, so obviously we have been building time travel into the web. There are lots of browser plugins and methods for looking at archival replays of web content over time in a way that is very familiar to browsing the live web. Collaborative models, some technical stuff. We do deduplicate content in cases. We do actually do and crawl RSS feeds, every link added to Wikipedia, every blogger entry, lots of other methods that we get automatic URL feeds that go right into the crawlers, and lots of automation around crawling activities. So the web has become much more dynamic, interactive, scrolling, clicking, and we're of course trying to build bots to do that behavior at scale. And then emulation, which Vint also talked about. What have we not been doing so great? The web has been moving, of course, more and more to a programming environment. It's not static documents, it's interactions, it's replay, it's behaviors, and those are very challenging to capture with our traditional archival methods. Appification, walled gardens, cloud computing, these are all mostly inaccessible except for with human intermediation or passwords or other methods. So that could really limit the amount of content we're able to capture. Interoperability, we're getting there, but a lot of web archiving systems don't necessarily talk to each other very well or require very centralized infrastructure to operate. And then bulk access is challenging at the scale at which we operate, which is the multi-petabyte scale, and making resources available for training and education in how things were captured or how you can work with them. So in looking at these sort of areas of archival activity, so I come from an archiving background, and I always try to think of web archiving within the traditional archival endeavor. And you sort of have these three modes of selection, capture, and management and access, which have not just code and technology involved, but of course communities as well. And so when you sort of think about networking between these different areas of operation and maybe pre-script your slide with a certain model, it actually starts to look quite similar to the original technical diagram of TCP. So I've been thinking a lot as a web history nerd of sort of the successes of the internet, and Vince spoke much more eloquently to this than I will. But what made the internet such the incredible, amazing thing that has just sort of conquered the world? And what can we, when building web archiving programs and technologies, take some of those key themes out? And so Vint talked about the modularization, the distributed nature, the portability and flexibility of a lot of the technical systems and protocols. I think the social construction of the internet's evolution was very important. It was not just producers creating for users, the producers were users, and that innovation was dispersed around a social community that was both informal and very feedback driven. And of course it was built for scalability, for gateway between networks, and for great fault tolerance. And we can sort of adapt some of these to web archiving. We are trying to modularize crawling, not just in the global and little special and domain style, but also the methods of capture, proxy browsing, traditional crawling, user interaction, archival replay, and capture while you actually browse, making works and metadata more portable between systems. The work is something of a heterogeneous format. But then also building on the lessons of the early net for social construction, community models, coordinated collecting, collaborations with K through 12 programs, as well as academic researchers, and then systems of interoperability and multiplicity of access models. And so I always try to close talks with sort of what are the big preservation imperatives. I think we wanted to go big and keep in mind for this conference at least, if we're going to work to save the web at scale, what are sort of our motivating factors? And I do think, obviously, I think as most of us do, the web is the most significant communication platform of our era. So we're living in a very unique historical moment that has a piece of technology that has changed a lot of how, not just how we buy things and interact and socialize, but really the whole sort of landscape of society. It also marks an unprecedented confluence of ease of publication and ease of archival acquisition. So archives used to have to go out and get things or pay for them or work with donors to get them. And it was very action driven. And things were published and they were sort of in some remote world. But we're in this unique moment where you can both make a blog and you can archive it within seconds, essentially. So that's a very unique characteristic of our moment of time. It also, I think, as David and Ian both spoke to, allows for this unprecedented plurality of representation within the historical record. You know, traditionally, archives were very much motivated by power or wealth. So the folks captured in the archive were often people that were of power and wealth and of a certain class, and it was very difficult to necessarily capture the day-to-day lives of average citizens, and that's really changed with the web. And then the last one is just the sort of great motivating factor that, as Wendy also mentioned, our moment in time where we can archive at scale and get this amazing, diverse record will be very, very brief in the sort of technological arc. And that's it. Thanks, everyone.
It's Marciano or Marciano? Okay. Just trying to get it right this time. So, it's my pleasure to introduce Richard Marciano of the University of Maryland, who has been leading thinker and doer in developing models for the preservation and dissemination of human records on the internet, and thinking about developing proper cyber infrastructures for that. And in his current role, he wears the hat of a center dedicated to exactly those questions, the newly formed Digital Curation Innovation Center. So looking forward to hearing about those efforts and his thoughts on the subject.
Yep.
Please.
Can you hear me? Okay, and I'll put my timer on because I think there's a crunch here as well. We don't have 3 minutes, but we have a little more. Forgot the clicker, thank you. Okay, so can't see it on this screen. Can I also see the slides on the laptop or just over here? Okay. So my name is Richard Marciano. I've been at the University of Maryland for a little over a year and a half. In my prior life, I spent over a decade at the San Diego Supercomputer Center as a computational type person working on interdisciplinary projects, and had a stint of 5-6 years at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill in the iSchool. So the theme I wanted to tease a little bit relates to almost everything we've heard so far, the notion of scale and size and plenty and the challenges and opportunities that result from that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what it means to preserve in the age of big data. So don't know if I can pull all these things off in the few minutes I have, but this is a little flow here, looking down. So I'll give you a little bit of background on a little context on this new center, collaborative center we created, what its goals are, what we're trying to achieve in terms of preservation, what some of the connections are with web archiving. I'll talk next about a particular project that's driving a lot of the cyber infrastructure development, which is National Science Foundation project. It's one of these new big data programs. This one's called DIBS, Data Information Building Blocks. So it's a software development effort. that tries to build preservation services in the cloud. I'll say a little bit about that. And then, since we're part of this session that's worded as the need for preservation, I wasn't sure if there was a question mark or if it was a given, or if we had to challenge the audience. So I'll say a few things about how I've tackled that and what's been funded, at least in my spaces, in the past. I'll talk about a recent workshop that was held in April that captures a lot of this energy, and an upcoming future workshop in December if any of you are interested in the DC area. And we'll end with just an exploration of some of the federal research, federal R&D guidance, and sort of future directions that were recently formulated through several documents. They don't directly address these notions of digital curation, but if we deconstruct that and try to pull it apart a little bit, I think we'll find a lot of really exciting terminology that we can pull back and claim and use to drive some of these agendas. So it's kind of looking at the past, looking at the future, and formulating a few questions for the audience, research questions. So the goal is to get to those questions, and depending on how we're doing with time, I'll zip through this and we'll get to that. So this is a new center we started at the University of Maryland. It's called Digital Curation Innovation Center. It looks at big records and archival analytics. There's some 50 people involved so far, lots of students, lots of colleagues interested in these issues, external researchers with former colleagues from the Library of Congress, National Archives, NEH, IMLS, several of whom are in the room, who are all contributing to this digital curation network we're trying to build, which is both educational, research, and also has an infrastructure dimension. So one of the pieces of infrastructure I wanted to highlight is something we're calling the data cave. Not as big as the Internet Archive, just a small thing, but it's a petascale archival storage and analytics facility. It's powered by NetApp storage, Dell Computing, and one of the innovations there is we're building, it's part of commercial startup, we're building an open source archival piece of software. It's brand new, something called Indigo. It leverages a NoSQL platform called Apache Cassandra, and it's being explored for long-term archival storage and preservation purposes. So the connection with Web Archives is that we're using that platform, testing it, building it, and we have some really interesting collections, about 100 million files, some 72 terabytes of data. This is work that was largely done with the National Archives and continues in other directions, but we've collected records from over 150 federal agencies, so records of all ilk, historical records, contemporary records. A lot of these were collected through crawling processes, but very often very targeted crawling processes. I can come back to that later. So that's our test bed. And the idea is that it's highly uncurated, it's structured, it's hierarchical, but it's highly uncurated, and it's extremely heterogeneous and diverse. So it's a big bag of miscellaneous things, and with thousands of file formats from obviously textual stuff, satellite imagery, databases, desktop, photos, name it, it's all in there. So that's a kind of our reference collection, and we're using that as a pretext to develop computational archival approaches and do some of the things you heard about in the hackathon that have to do with automation and doing that at scale. So a couple of words on Indigo. Look at my clock here. Hope that siren is not related. So built on Apache Cassandra, it was originally developed by Facebook. It's used by a plethora of companies, from Adobe to Travelocity, T-Mobile, etc. highly scalable, so it scales to petabytes hundreds of petabytes of nodes. It's actually used to manage distributed data centers, so that's our platform. There's no external file system. There's no single point of failure. Data is automatically replicated and compressed, and you can store arbitrary data objects and tag them with metadata and create hierarchies and containers and all kinds of things. So it allows organizations to deposit data objects in a directory tree, and then there's a whole mechanism based on, sorry, I'm looking down here. There's a whole mechanism based on triggers and actions, and so there's a whole philosophy behind this of sort of not self-archiving archives, but sort of self-cleaning archives and things that, that can do a lot of automation, so self-managing repositories. So very quickly, so number two, so we're using all these layers to design. This is part of NSF collaboration with National Center for Supercomputing Applications in Illinois. So we're developing essentially a series of cloud-based digital preservation services. There are two classes of services: legacy format converters, and then there's a slew of information extraction mechanisms. All right, so what's been funded? I did a little walk back through time. This is just for reference. Pulled titles of all kinds of projects I've been involved with. I was more interested in looking sort of at the signature of funding and which agencies have been involved over the last few decades. And just in my own projects, some of my own projects listed here, obviously it's National Archives, Library of Congress, NSF, NHPRC, IMLS, Canadian SSHRC, Homeland Security, Mellon Foundation, DARPA. And one of the themes here is preservation of digital data, self-validating archives, notions of automation. If I place all these projects and I try to pull out sort of themes, I do a little topic modeling inside that bubble, you see the complexity of all this. You have thousands of data types, representative of what you find on the web, all these different categories of preservation, from geospatial data to digital humanities with ethical considerations, scale, looking at workflows, on and on. And a lot of what you have with big data is represented here. So you might make a claim that all the V's are in there, but you also have another column which is all the V's for eternity. So how do you deal with volume, variety, veracity, velocity at times, not always? And how do you keep that around for a long, long time? So very quickly, these are references, they'll be in the slides. So we had a recent workshop, if any of you are interested in this. There's slides and videos in April looking at computational archival science and positing that we need to sort of contribute to moving this space in this field towards what colleagues are doing in other spaces, computational social science, computational journalism, and that there's a place for computational archival science. And we're forming a new community. If any of you are interested, contact us, come and join us. This is kind of building a social network. There's an upcoming workshop in December at the IEEE Big Data Conference in DC, where we'll be looking at these issues of digital records in the age of big data, including web records. Last couple of comments. There's some really interesting documents, federal documents that were just released. So I put a few notes in here. Not going to paraphrase, but I invite you to take a look at those. While the funding agendas don't directly talk about digital preservation or archival curation, digital curation or archival science per se, there's a lot to build on. And these are two documents from the NIDARD group. So this is out of the Office of Science Technology Policy of the White House. There's an April document, which is the federal R&D supplementary budget for 2017. So if you actually, NIDARD is the organization that coordinates all the federal R&D investments and makes recommendations of what the research priorities are for the following year. NARA's on here, NSF is on here, a lot of people in the room are involved with this. So if you look at the very latest Document, I highlighted sections 5 and 6. These have been completely reworked, and even 6 is brand new. There's a whole section on information management and large-scale data management and analysis. And these are really worth looking at. And I highlighted in red all those areas that are congruent to the themes of the workshop and research topics today. And these are highlighted as growth areas, funding areas, futuristic areas, and this is an opportunity for all of us to work together to see if we can tap into these recommendations and make a mark and voice our voices. So a lot of interesting stuff here. Last document, and I'll wrap up after that. This just came out a few weeks ago. Maria Zemenkova would probably know about this. This is Federal Big Data Research Development Strategic Plan. Extremely interesting. There are all these considerations on authenticity. A lot of the issues that are referenced here have to do with trust, which is a fundamental issue for all of us. What is trust? There are issues of ethics, there are issues of training, there are issues of developing the right kind of systems and cyber infrastructure and what that means. Lots of references to trustworthy digital repositories, which came out of OAIS and conversations, et cetera, where many of you have been involved. So a few questions and we'll end on this. So looking at that kind of landscape and the things we're trying to start, here are a few questions, maybe for the panel, maybe for later on in the day. So do we really need to preserve the web? Don't laugh. Yes. How much of it? All of it? Is it, do we use archival appraisal mechanisms? Or how selective do we want to be? What's the scale? What does it look like? Who decides what gets preserved? Those aren't obvious questions for me. You may have deeper insights. How do we get at the deep web? And our first speaker talked about some of those issues. What are we missing? What technologies do we need to develop further? Do people have the right to be forgotten? That's a big theme. What are the ethics of remembering? How do we leverage those things? How do we actually preserve the web as a socio-technical system and from a technological standpoint? What are the strategies? Are there things we haven't thought of? Who are we preserving the web for? So the chair of the panel talked about, well, we don't know who the future users are. So one of my former colleagues actually defines preservation as this sort of act of faith, this time travel machine where you're communicating with unborn historians and future citizens, and you have no idea how to get there. All you know is the present, and sort of you're navigating and you're trying to move forward. So it's the shadows on the cave. You're seeing shadows, and you're trying to devise what this glorious future might look like, and you're impeded by all the limitations of the moment. So one of the themes I've actually gotten funding for and looked at is this notion of what does software independence mean? How do you characterize that? And how do you create virtualization logical environments? So a few more questions and we're done. How do we leverage the preserved web? So what do we do with that? What kinds of analytics are we going to look at? What can we do right now? What could we do in the future? Who will be paying for this? So you heard several comments on this. What's the business model? And then a more technological theme that comes out of some of the slides I shared with you is how do we move towards building systems of trust? So trustworthy, complex, highly scalable, distributed systems, and what are all the implications there? So there's a slew of issues, and I've been working in this field for over 15 years. I would venture to say, this is a contentious statement, that we've made some progress, but that we really don't know how to solve most of these issues. So this is still a research question, and it's wide open, and it's why it's so exciting, and it's why we need to develop networks and communities to continue to tackle all these problems. Thank you.
Just to introduce Contemporary British Collections, which is essentially the British Library's sound archive, contemporary manuscripts from 1950 onwards, and published works from about 2000 onwards. And by published, we include the UK Web Archive, and we include the newspaper collections. What I thought I would do is not tell you too much about the library, but take this opportunity to think, hopefully philosophically, hopefully not ponderously, a little bit about the advocacy of preservation. And the question I posed myself was, why are we still talking about advocacy? Why is that after, in one way, so long, years and years? In terms of published output, not very long. Dame Wendy's completely right. It's actually just a blink in some ways. And to characterize that from a National Library point of view, legal deposit is a French invention in modern times, 16th century. It comes into England with effect in legal terms from the 17th century, but really enforced by Antonio Panizzi, the librarian at the British Museum Library in the 19th century. So we're talking about centuries of, in theory, legal deposit, which is to bring every copy in the land into one or multiple places, really. The idea of positive duplication is very important to legal deposit in the same way as it's very important to having nodes of digital content. So I'm briefly going to call this talk Goes Without Saying, because it's about advocacy, goes without saying. And so I'm turning that phrase on its head because there's so much implicit in what we say that we believe in the web and we want to preserve it. That goes without saying. But if you don't say it, it's going to go. There has to be an advocacy element to this. And that advocacy element is actually really complicated. And you come across mixed messages that you have to tell to do with expectation, anxiety, fear, idealism. They're not all the same story that we tell or that users and potential influencers can hear. So for any category of collecting, it's good practice to pause a little and think why you're doing it, why you're spending this money. But for new technology, it's particularly important because you can make future-proof less decisions that can be very expensive. Thinking about why we need to advocate preservation also immediately gets you into the kind of nexus of complexity. The web is certainly a layered network, a kind of ecosystem, and the way you cut it culturally, it's an intellectual, artistic, social, political, economic system. That's before you even get to the complexity of the technical detail, which is not detail in the sense of something you can brush off. It's absolutely fundamental to the preservation challenge. Within each of those cultural challenges, there's a different kind of advocacy piece. We've talked about general elections, and that was a selection priority. We also collect the general elections in our country. But that's already you have made a decision to prioritize essentially the way an established political system works. So you haven't been collecting in the same detail other kinds of ideas, political ideas, which don't reach the mainstream. So it's very, very difficult not to prioritize by accident or by things which go without saying. It's important we keep on interrogating our own assumptions. I also want to share some of the National Library difficulties and pay tribute to the Internet Archive for actually being the digital library so quickly off the ground. National libraries can seem and are in many ways slow, but we're slow. And there are good reasons for that, and I want to explain some of those in terms of advocacy. It's not just that we're trying to win over external stakeholders and people who are going to fund us and support us. We're also having internal debates about the importance of digital and how we can fund this. One of the fantastic myths, of course, about digital is it's somehow free. It's somehow free, and we internalize that, even as information professionals, we internalize that. In actual fact, it's very expensive to build that infrastructure and to bring those curators and those technical people in. And guess what? Our budgets are not blooming to accommodate this rightly thirsty wish to take in more. It's actually much more tricky than that. I think there's also, in bold terms, there's also a kind of competition. I mean, we're friends within the library, but there's a kind of competition between the old kind of heritage, some of which is actually in my collection as well. I'm talking about ordinary books and ordinary magazines and journals, and the new kind of what we think of as heritage, but is not a given. Doesn't go without saying. There is a case for making our work heritage, a kind of new heritage. And that's quite a complicated argument. We can say it's like the heritage we're so glad we got. It's just the same sort of thing. And in some cases, that's sort of true. So newspapers which only appear online are a bit like the newspapers that we got. So the Burney collection is a Civil War, English Civil War collection. Great, we got those. And now we can collect news about Brexit, EU referendum. Not saying that's an English Civil War. Maybe it is, maybe it is. So we can do those kind of equivalents. And that's quite a good way of advocating. We can also say to our heritage colleagues, you know that stuff you're a bit embarrassed about getting and you've not done anything with, it's sort of uncatalogued. We've got the same sort of equivalent, those kind of flyers, those posters that you've never really had the resource to catalogue. We've got those, and we're going to catalogue them in a completely different way because we have the data. Well, the advocacy piece needs public access. Public access is the best advocate. And because of our legal deposit commitments, although we have a whole lot of stuff now in the British Library, it's very difficult for us to share that. And even when you get into the reading room, the render can be surprisingly poor. And that's because web archiving is like that. You're not getting a looks and feel translation all the time. Well, I've got tentative solutions, and they're really sort of 2 or 3. One is for us to occupy the old spaces. And by that, I mean meet each other, meet each other, just like this. It's really, really important that we behave non-virtually. And lastly, of course, occupy the new spaces. I have lots of other kind of subheadings for these things. Maybe I can squeeze them in a wee bit later in the discussion. So occupy the old spaces. Don't neglect those. Have websites on exhibition alongside physical objects. Don't forget about that. It sends fantastic and really strong messages about the parallel nature of that. Last thing, be poetic. Poetry like time traveling with the web archive, that's an incredibly strong message. It's much, much stronger than more watertight theory and mathematical understanding for a general population. So be poetic. a lovely note to end on. And now, finally, Abigail Gracke of the library, who's been working on these issues for a long time and leads the, well, it's a long committee name, the National Digital Information Infrastructure Preservation Program.
Actually, we've been reorganized.
Oh, been reorganized? Well, you know.
Web archiving team.
I'm looking at an archived version of
Just Google me. You can find
me.
me.
In any case, thank you, Abigail.
With the last name of Gracke, that's very easily Googleable, if you can spell it. So welcome, everybody. We're thrilled to have you in our home turf today. We don't often get to host web archiving events. Since I've been doing this, I've been involved in the web archiving program since 2002, I think, along with my colleague Gina Jones over here. David talked a little bit about the program, but I'll give you a little bit more of our history and how we got to where we are and the things that still keep us up at night, because there are many. We started in 2000 as a pilot program to explore collecting web content. There was an interdisciplinary team, including some folks that are actually in this room. I think Jane was on that team, looking at issues around technical approaches, cataloging of data, selection of content, and of course the ever-present legal issues. We started with our election archives, as many organizations who do this work do, the election 2000, and we were happily starting to plan the election 2002 archive as another pilot with some collaborations with the Internet Archive in those early days as well, when September 11th happened. And we quickly realized that this was something real and we had to make it not a pilot anymore. So we went quickly into production without really sorting out what that actually meant. And I can safely say that all these years later, we're still grappling with all these same issues. We haven't really solved all of the concerns that were even brought up in those early days. So our approach here is a curated, selective collecting activity. We select content in various events and themes to archive. We do not have the luxury of an easily defined US domain to crawl like our colleagues in the UK or Iceland. We're very envious of Iceland. So we also have a lack of copyright laws that really support the activities. So and no legal mandate to do this work. So we actually, we have a pretty intensive and labor-intensive and complicated permissions process that I don't have time to go into today, but I can spend hours talking about it. We're very good friends with the lawyers in the library. The program is really, we have a very small core team that works full-time on the activity, but there are people scattered around the library that work on this, and it's kind of reflective of the collaborations that we've all undertaken with other institutions, which is so critical to this work. We really can't do it alone, and we need all sorts of people, and it's reflective in the research projects that happen this week, that you need selectors selecting the content, you need technical experts, you need the lawyers to tell you how to do this work, you need developers that are supporting other infrastructure aspects, you need the storage experts that can help manage all of this data. So we really couldn't do it without these different types of people. And as Jefferson talked about, we collaborate quite a bit with the broader community, like the International Internet Preservation Consortium. We were a founding member with the Internet Archive in that organization, and things like the end-of-term Government Web Archive, and working with some of our federal colleagues who are here in the room on issues around collecting the federal government domain. So again, the permissions process I won't go into hugely, but we do have to notify almost every site that we crawl. So we have built tools around this to help process all of these things and send out permission letters and get responses. Mostly people like what we do, but we do have a lack of response issue, which I think is reflected in other archives as well. Most people don't say no, they just don't ever respond to us. So that creates unbalanced collections when you are trying to, when there are types of sites that you must ask permission for and then they don't respond. So there are gaps in the collection because of that. Luckily, the permissions policies have evolved over time and they keep evolving and are becoming a little bit more lenient. So we can do more, but we still have to notify everybody. This is a lot of work. So we have, Internet Archive does most of our crawling under contract for the Library of Congress. We don't really have the technical infrastructure here to do that work. but we do some in-house crawling using the same open source tools that they are using. We schedule our crawls under a variety of frequencies depending on topics, so managing all of that and trying to sort through all the content that we're trying to schedule and crawl and make sure we have is complex. I'll talk a little bit later about some of the crawling strategies that we've employed in recent years to try to capture some of that frequently changing content. Our search is pretty basic at this point. My one visual here is our public access website, which allows you to search some metadata records that take you to our instance of the Wayback Machine. We are very excited about the use of our data this week and the possibilities that we can now see for using our data in other ways. So we look forward to the future working with researchers. Some statistics about our archive. We have about 90 total web archive collections in a variety of themes that we're managing. Again, government sites, law, content. We have things like, obviously, our US elections. Don't worry, we're getting all those campaign sites. We do things like collecting web comics. Some of our curators here are in the room who have selected that content. So we're trying to get a broad view, but it really is those people in the library that are interested in web archives who kind of get it. So there are gaps in the collection. We don't cover all subjects that the library collects in other materials. We have 22 websites available through our public access website. So that's about a third of our collections, which we're hoping to improve. We seem to get ahead in some areas and then fall behind in others. That's one of the things that keeps us up at night. We have about 25 active collections that we're managing right now, mostly ongoing crawls. So we're getting sort of, in the early days, we had a lot of collections that started and stopped, and now we have things that go on and on and on, sort of these long-term things, rather than time-bounded. We're bringing in about 15 to 20 terabytes per month these days, and I have charts that are similar to Jefferson's showing the amount of data. We are much smaller scale. We have about a petabyte of data of web archive content, but really it's YouTube's fault. I mean, they really ruined everything for us in 2005, and you can see the numbers just went crazy after that. We're expecting to get about 290 terabytes this year alone. And in the early days, we were, I don't know, it was about half a terabyte in the first year. In all of those collections, we manage about 6,000 seed URLs at, again, varying frequencies. So we're trying to use our tools and our brains to manage all of that and juggle all that collecting activity. And as one of my colleagues likes to say, it's basically the scale of domain crawling, but at a selective level, which is very complex to manage, particularly when you're thinking about asking permission for all of those sites. And we are very lucky here. The management of the Library of Congress is very supportive, and there's definitely they understand the need for preservation. We have a steady budget at this point for crawling. It does not cover other aspects of the workflow right now, which is one of our challenges. But we are a more formal established program, and I think we have job security. I don't think we're going away, no matter how many reorganizations we participate in. And the great news is I no longer have to explain what web archiving is to many of my colleagues across the library. In the early days, it was the first half hour of the presentation was, here's what a web archive is. It is not downloading to your desktop. So some of the bigger challenges that we face, it really gets at some of what you've heard already with the selective archiving. What do we actually select? There's just so much out there. And what topics do we cover? We have selection policies that cover some of what might be the things that we do, but there's also trying to figure out what our space is and to avoid duplication with what other libraries are doing, particularly in the US when we have hundreds of organizations that are collecting content. How do we know what we should be taking responsibility for? And there's just so much, the data, it's so big, and we are so little. There are so few of us. So there's also this desire in all of this massive data to get everything, so to get quality, complete captures of websites. Think about how large some of these sites are, some of these government sites that we're crawling, and hoping we get that PDF that might be useful to the Congressional Research Service someday, or or the one document that somebody might need in the future. We can't guarantee it. We can't do it. So trying to grapple with those issues and make the case that what we're getting is good enough and good. And the crawler, Jefferson already talked about this a little bit. There's been advancements in how the crawler tools are being developed. Keeping up with all of the changes in the web is very difficult. We often joke in the IIPC that we're about 10 years behind what's happening on the web now with the crawler tools. So little changes that Facebook can make can just mess us up forever. So it's a big challenge. Let's see, jumping ahead here. So some of the things we're doing to tackle some of these scale problems and get deeper crawls of some of the sites that are of interest to our recommending officers are doing deeper quarterly crawls of some of these really large, like state.gov, that's a huge site, and trying to get that in a monthly crawl where you're just getting a little bit along with all the other sites that we're crawling has been a challenge. So we're now doing like really deep focus crawls on that content. We're also employing some RSS feed crawling, modeled after what some folks in Iceland are doing for some news content that changes so rapidly that we can't get it in a weekly crawl even. So we're doing crawling feeds and being able to fill out the gaps in the collection that way. So we think we've been doing that about 6 months or a year maybe, and that's been going pretty well. I have a few minutes left. Some of the other issues, again, around the permissions policies. We keep hoping for changes and that the site owners will respond favorably, but we can't rely on that. So again, the unbalanced collections is a big issue for us. And it also creates a data set that has a mixture of permissions in it. So we find it difficult to share our data sets with researchers because we have some content that's restricted to on-site only and some that isn't, and others that are perfectly free to use no matter where you are. So all of that is stored together in one archive, and how do we share that? And again, our staff is limited. We can only do so much, and our focus is really in acquiring the data. We don't have the resources to really work to help make our collections more accessible, which is we hope to do that in the future, and that we can make progress in those areas. And we are truly inspired by all of you here and all the people that worked with the data this week. It's very, very exciting to see. So I think I'll close there because I see the zero coming. I guess move on to questions.
Thank you. So is the mic circulating? The questions? Us, in the back. And if you could just say who you are, and that would be great.
Hi. Hi, there we go. Hi, I'm John Wendt. I actually work under Abby here at the library, but I kind of had a question for the rest of the panel. Just in terms of like the threshold between automation and human curation of this content, just in my own experiences, knowing I've made certain mistakes and screwing up an entire collection because of it, where do we really find the sort of point where we can hand this off to an automated program, or what are your sort of thoughts on where we can find that point in the future?
I guess I'll talk. That's a great question. I think there are efforts to do, so I talked a little bit about browser automation, but browser automation will never get to the scale of human action. There are efforts to, and this is not really scalable, but I do think it's a potential approach for transactional browsing. So if you are a person and you can essentially flip a switch in your browser and it will record to a preservation format as you browse. So you obviously need some self-awareness about what you're browsing to make sure that it doesn't go into the archival record. But I think that has potential, but it obviously won't scale to the extent to which the web grows. So I think it's probably not an automation human question, it's more a multi-institutional question. So the more institutions that are doing even small scale web archiving will contribute to this greater pool of archival data.
Is there room for harnessing the crowd for this, like getting people looking, saying, well, you know, you're messing up this collection, and having like bug reports? I mean, you know, that kind of thing.
Yeah, there are tools sort of in the browser where you can, you know, report a bad capture or tell it if their image is missing in an archival copy. It can try to find whether those URLs still exist. They could have been not captured for various technical reasons, and then could be scoped in during browsing. So there's a little automated QA that can be done.
I think public intervention also builds advocacy. So you don't really want to get rid of public selectors or curatorial selectors. It's very good to have fan-based selectors who are actually going to bring a kind of loyalty and an enthusiasm to a wider project, even though it may be niche. The fact is that that is a very enthusiasm is leaky in a very good way, and it goes over to a general populace. And so it's very important that some things, although they could be fully automatable, are still personalized.
Questions will go to the middle. We'll go number 2 and number 3. So. If we're going to archive this.
So Maria Zamankova, National Science Foundation, and I think it's about 3 years ago when we had a workshop, Gary Marcioni was really chairing it, on curation. The reason why we had held it, because we wanted to find out what techniques could be developed for what we had called as painless curation. Because without curation, if we store it all, I don't think it's very useful, okay? The report has been published at ACM Communications, and I think there is a lot to be learned from that workshop. But I think one point that we did not quite touch upon is archiving or evolving of the curations across the centuries. We have been talking here about preserving the cultural heritage and this and that and whatnot. We all of us know about the concept drifts. What about the curation drifts?
You can pass it back, and then we'll ask the next question later. So reactions. it's just one you got to chew on a little bit.
I do think there's more potential for crowdsourcing. As we mentioned, we do a lot of spontaneous event collections, which are community-submitted URLs, our sites. And I do think that's much different than the traditional archival, appraisal, or acquisition model, which is driven by an institution or by a university. So I think the curation aspect has drifted into the public a bit, but you do sort of have that separation between the act of nominating something and the act of actually acquiring it and preserving it. Mm-hmm. So it would be interesting to think about how the sort of curation drift could also move into the preservation drift.
I suppose I like the idea of there being curation drift across the older heritage and the newer heritage, across the disciplines. So social scientists, computational people, linguistic corpus people looking at 19th century, those techniques, very useful to contemporary. We want to have a text and data mining community that crosses all that. Again, occupying the old space, scholars meeting up across the divide with librarians is very, very important for that, particularly at this stage.
Okay. I think I promised yes, thank you. And then, yes, you can be online. I just want to make sure I'm not neglecting the peripheries here. So.
My name is Megan Halsband. I'm a reference librarian here at the Library of Congress, and actually I work on some of the web archiving collections. And kind of from a, I guess, curatorial point of view, going along with what everyone else has been talking about, what are some ways that you might see that those of us who are, you know, maybe selecting content can help more formally broaden the conversation between institutions and between disciplines and between, you know, professional societies, because it seems like there's a lot of conversation that happens on the same topics between, historians and between art historians and between computer scientists, but there's the cross-pollinization of it, and kind of that cross-discussion doesn't really seem to happen very much on a very formal platform or a formal way that I'm aware of. I could be very out of it though. And so just some thoughts on what, future planning might be for that, so that, to help librarians and to help those of us who are working on these types of collections make sure that we're making responsible curatorial decisions.
Thoughts? I mean, I think part of what my reaction is, it's an interesting question of how to engage the relevant communities and get them in the room talking about this. And so is there a space, for example, going to the political science meetings and saying, what do you need archived on campaign 2016, right? I'd be happy to facilitate that, but that's just more of a model of how one might engage a community that is going to want to chew on these collections like tomorrow. But of course, that's not necessarily representing the unborn historians that well. So,
I'd like to believe that perhaps as part of your arsenal and moving forward, you'll be fully weaponized, a terrible expression, but that there'll be other paradigms, and these are things that are being funded and that are being explored and that are part of interdisciplinary conversations. There are probably not enough of them, so this is my shameless cue to the folks from the funding agencies to help us create these spaces where we can bring these communities together to continue to explore these topics, such as the meeting you mentioned several years ago. But I don't know, the reference or selector of the future will have a dashboard, and we'll be able to do, hopefully, analytics on the fly, and you'll be able to examine some of the collections yourself and perform elements of machine learning and discovery and visualization, and make even more informed decisions at scale, looking at collections and across collections and mixing, multimedia and historical records and other things. So there are all kinds of human-computer interface issues that build on these conversations, that would benefit from these conversations, and build on the integration of a lot of the frameworks and technologies that are also very siloed, that are funded through all these different agencies and programs, et cetera. So I'd love to see that happen, and there's some interesting examples of what that might look like in terms of future finding aids or futuristic finding aids, and how to build those, and what curatorial support you might have in moving forward.
Why don't I collect just a few questions, because we're nearing the end, and I see that, and I hate to leave questions unasked, but there's also that curatorial role I have. So why don't we collect a few questions, and then people can react to whatever questions they want to react to. Yes.
My name is Mary Fraker, and I've probably been watching too many reruns of Law and Order SVU. But I'm wondering what is sort of the ethics, the philosophy, the policy, and the practice regarding really repugnant things like child pornography.
Good question. And I think, like I said, I just want to collect a few questions.
Yeah.
So.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I don't know. Thank you so much, Mr. David. I didn't know we were coming to the same event for your courtesy this morning. God bless you. Thank you so much for your presentation. My name is Rosemary Seguero. I'm the president of an organization called Hope for Tomorrow and Seguero's International Group. Looking at your presentations, earlier the gentleman for counterterrorism spoke. He's here, we'll talk later. How do you look at engaging international people, IT people, groups? All you are talking goes international, the website, the election observation. I do election observations in Africa using my own applications I'll share with you. So how do we put this content and what you are discussing into the international level so that we are talking internationally, because all you are talking is used out there, but many people don't know how, even if they have the IT, we want to make it universal so that what you are talking here at the Congress is talked in Africa, is talked somewhere else, so that we are on the same page, so that we don't blame each other. One day somebody did somebody, because those smart guys are not here who do the hacking, who do bad stuff. They are out there, so they need to get the message, and getting this knowledge is very important. So how do we collaborate with you all to make sure we bring them for India, you go to Africa for a conference like this one and talk to people? So thank you so much.
Great. And any other questions on the left that we want to collect? Anyone here want to get a last shot of questions? How about on the right? I think I saw any hands there. Okay, so we're left with the ethical issues on the sort of more global international perspective, to put it really short. So reactions.
I could speak a little bit to the global efforts. I think part of this, because it's still very new, the early group that formed around the international community, I mean, there's a big European focus, but there is an effort to expand that community, work globally together on these issues. We all understand that the web is not the US domain and the Icelandic domain or the British domain. It's a global internet. So even though we're all collecting in different areas, we all are aware that our archives, and we all struggle with trying to make this happen, to link those archives and connect them so that researchers will know that we have all this data gathered around. There are efforts within the IIPC to reach other communities that we're not currently engaging with, and try to expand our membership or collect in areas where archiving may not be happening, such as the Cuban domain. So I think it's definitely a concern of all of ours. The Library of Congress also, I didn't mention, we have offices overseas, so we have a number of international collections. So we are not just collecting US content, we are collecting across the globe in areas that the library traditionally has collected in. So.
From an ethical point of view, well, I suppose there's also a practical element to this. Child pornography is probably on the deep web. We probably wouldn't be able to get it in the first place. If we do get it, it wouldn't have been actively. We certainly won't actively select that. It would come in through a domain crawl. And because it comes in that way, we're protected legally until we notice we've got it, and then we will take it out of public access. It would be illegal for us to knowingly maintain it. So that's never happened to my knowledge. I'm sure in the long view that the legal deposit libraries and national libraries take it will happen at some point, but that's how we would approach it.
I think there are all kinds of other aspects of ethics when it comes to collecting large distributed content, very much like the credit card companies and all the social media companies that classify our actions, identify what we do, derive knowledge from what we browse, what we look at. We're reaching the point where you can take several cultural, historical, archival sources and start to find and reveal really interesting things that may lead to problematic ethical findings in the data. So you can reveal sort of the hidden information, correlate it, bring it back together, de-identify people, places, events that were not meant to be shared. So this is a side effect, I guess, of the technology of crawling. It may not happen in one swoop, but it's not that hard to do. One of the collections in the DCIC lab we were looking at, which included conversations with former inmates and survivors, was, for example, was looking at Second World War, Japanese-American internment camp data. And one of our computational interventions was precisely to link all the people, the events. These were Stasi-like accusations of alleged misdeeds while people were prisoners, many of them invented or imaginary. So you start putting these things together and you build and you use modern analytics or commercial style analytics, and you're rebuilding, as we saw in some of the student in hackathon projects, you're revealing social networks and occurrences of individuals and peoples in the context of accusations, it is very, very problematic. So there's this whole other layer of how you very quickly stumble into all kinds of ethical dilemmas and implications when you're harvesting a large distributed archives and bringing all this information together. And I think that's a really important theme. National Science Foundation has a whole number of discussions on the ethics of big data and archival collections and moving forward.
A perfect note to end on. I want to thank our panelists and our audience.
Thank you very much, panel. That was a really good debate there. Vint asked me to point out that, as he was going, that it's really important that we're focusing a lot on archiving what's already on the web, but we need to add more by adding the context, the political, the economic, the historical context, to help people in the future understand what's going on today. Right, now's the time for a break. Looks like it's lovely. It's not pouring with rain. This room will be locked for lunch. Please be back here for 2. There are suggestions, if you don't know the area, there's some lovely little cafes just over the road. Get some fresh air. And please be back here before 2 and come back and see us. Don't disappear.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.